I became interested in Ludwig Wittgenstein, and especially in his masterpiece, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, after playing a visual novel that references it extensively, called Subarashiki Hibi Furin Zoku Sonzai. And so I've been researching it off and on over the past year and a half or so. In this video, I want to do my best to make this endlessly fascinating, rich, and mysterious work accessible to others. I do not plan to do a full biography of Wittgenstein in this video, but in all ways he was a fascinating individual and truly singular mind. For a thorough look at Wittgenstein's life story, I highly recommend the biography Ludwig Wittgenstein, The Duty of Genius by Ray Monk. However, in many ways Wittgenstein's idiosyncratic and unusual personality and worldview have deeply influenced how we should read and understand his philosophy and his manner of expressing ideas, so it is worth mentioning in some ways. Wittgenstein mostly read literature, poetry, and scientific or mathematical works, not philosophy. This gives his work a strange mix of both clinical scientific taciturnity and poetic richness. It also makes his work, as difficult to grasp as it is, somewhat easy to set the historical foundations of. This is because the philosophers he directly addresses are few in number, and therefore he doesn't assume we've all read our Plato or Aristotle, for example. He was born in Austria and moved to England to study aeronautics, but became interested in the theoretical and philosophical foundations of mathematics. He was here introduced to the two figures who are engaged with thoroughly throughout the Tractatus, namely Gottlob Frege and Bertrand Russell. I will thoroughly introduce the philosophical insights of these two figures when they are introduced in the Tractatus proper, but some word about their place in the philosophical tradition is required. Gottlob Frege was a German mathematics professor whose role in philosophical history is of tremendous importance, but in some ways has been forgotten until interest in Wittgenstein caused a renewal of interest in his influence Frege along with him. Frege's chief accomplishment was in introducing the first system of propositional logical calculus to the Western philosophical tradition. Anyone who has taken a logic class has a long tradition going back to Frege to thank for it, even if Frege's notational system was never widely used, since it is cumbersome and awkward. Instead, I'll illustrate it with the notation that Wittgenstein uses. For an illustration of propositional logical calculus, we'll use three basic facts that we want to analyze the truth and falsity of. These will be P, the store is open today, Q, Mary is going to the store today, and R, John is going to the store today. So if we want to write either John or Mary, or both, are going to the store today, we would write Q or R. This V-like symbol means or. If we want to express that John is going to the store today, but Mary isn't, we would write R and not Q in this notation. Wittgenstein uses a period to signify and, that this is true and also this is true. In modern logic, we almost always use an ampersand, but Wittgenstein uses the period so extensively that I'll stick with this for my notation. And the tilde before Q simply means negation, that it is not the case that Q, Mary is going to the store today. And lastly, if we want to write, the store is open today, and either John or Mary is going, we would write it as P and Q or R. We use parentheses around Q or R to make it clear where our symbols should be distributed, just like in mathematics. It is the invention of a sort of propositional logical notation similar to this that Frege is most remembered for today. However, he also had positions about the metaphysics of mathematics and logic of his own. These would be responded to by Wittgenstein, but they had their most thorough investigation and critique first and foremost by the most influential thinker in Wittgenstein's life, Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell was not only a profound influence on Wittgenstein's thought, but the two actually became close friends for an extended period, before growing distant sometime around the mid to late 1920s. Unlike Wittgenstein and Frege, Russell was in many ways as engaged in social criticism, political activism, and other such humanitarian pursuits as he was philosophy, and had a disposition to jumping around disciplines and philosophical activities. His skeptical arguments against theism and liberal social positions made him most known to ordinary members of society, and in many ways he was an early public intellectual, in the same manner as someone like Noam Chomsky or Slavoj Žižek would be today. However, Wittgenstein had no interest in these aspects of his work, and in fact thought very negatively of them in many ways. The thoughts of Russell that will be addressed in the Tractatus are primarily related to the ontology of facts in logic, the representational role of language, and the role of axioms in logic and mathematics. Though the two most important thinkers for Wittgenstein are undoubtedly Frege and Russell, he did have other philosophical thinkers who were of importance to him. For example, we know that he read Arthur Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation at a young age at the recommendation of his older sister, and never shed its influence. Baruch Spinoza is another thinker who is alluded to in subtle ways in the Tractatus. The Tractatus's title is in fact an homage to Spinoza's Tractatus Politico-Philosophicus, and the Tractatus seems to have been inspired by Spinoza's ethics and its austere arrangement of its thought into fundamental axioms with implicit argumentation, though Wittgenstein takes this to stylistic extremes not seen in Spinoza. Wittgenstein was always overwhelmed with a drive toward finding truth and perfecting his thought, and was a highly systematic thinker, but also seems to have went through many profound changes in his philosophical views. He seemed to possess a near obsessive level of perfectionism toward his thought. This we can see in how few of his works actually managed to be completed. In Wittgenstein's life, he only published one complete philosophical work, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. That said, his manuscripts and notebooks are extensive and have more than made up for this. His other most famous work is called the Philosophical Investigations, which he arranged to have published shortly after his death in 1951. It is substantive and driven enough that it is common to consider the Tractatus and Investigations as the two legitimate philosophical masterpieces of Wittgenstein, but the Investigations is, for all intents and purposes, technically unfinished. The two works seem to present very different philosophies, or at least to address philosophical problems in fundamentally different ways and from different angles. It has been customary to split Wittgenstein's thought into the early and late Wittgenstein, with the early represented by the Tractatus and his early notebooks, and the later by everything published afterward. However, in modern Wittgensteinian studies, it is often questioned how much is really different between these two eras. The biggest difference seems to me to only be a greater attention toward questions that are in Wittgenstein's language, situated in the quote-unquote stream of life, and thus more attuned towards things like psychology and epistemology. It is a common misconception that Wittgenstein's later philosophy abandoned his interest in logic and mathematics. This is not true. It is simply not as technical, and perhaps not written for logicians and mathematicians, so to say. With that in mind, this video is wholly about the early Wittgenstein, although near the end we'll touch again on just how much difference there really is between the two. While this is, in the end, a portrait of Wittgenstein's philosophy and not Wittgenstein the man, it is exceptionally hard to distinguish the two at times. Wittgenstein put a lot of himself into his work, and his work deeply influenced the way he lived. The only thing we should note about Wittgenstein the man is that he was an idiosyncratic, deeply sensitive, and somewhat enigmatic figure. He obviously had a very rich inner world that he had trouble translating to others and reconciling with an ever-disappointing world around him. It is always dicey to try to diagnose the mental disorders of those in the past, but I do believe that there is convincing evidence that Wittgenstein's eccentricity may have been in some degree due to one. Many have suggested he may have had a mild autism spectrum disorder or perhaps schizoid personality disorder, as well as repressed homosexuality. The details are not particularly important for us, but they do give some insight into his unique method of communication, restrained, peculiar, and uncompromising. With that in mind, his way of expressing himself will seem strange to most, both within his writing and outside of it, but at the same time, it is often only through this unique and self-contained sense of expression that Wittgenstein is able to express the most beguiling aspects of his thought. With that in mind, let's talk about exactly what the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus is. Wittgenstein began studying under Bertrand Russell in 1911, and dedicated himself with strenuous ardor to logical and mathematical conundrums in philosophy. He enlisted in the army upon the outbreak of World War I in 1914, and served in various positions all the way to the war's end in 1918. And not only did he return from the line of duty with honors for bravery, but also with one of the most unique, beguiling, and challenging philosophical works ever written. This was the work that would become known as the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, honed to perfection over 4 grueling years of war. He was quite confident that with this one work, he had solved all problems of philosophy. At this moment, it's worth examining the exact form of the Tractatus to see just how different it is from an average philosophical text. The Tractatus certainly gives credence to the idea that the most challenging works of philosophy are all written in German, and it stands alongside Georg Friedrich Wilhelm Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit and Martin Heidegger's Being and Time as a dense work whose exact meaning is still a matter of debate to the present day. However, there's something quite different between those. Hegel's and Heidegger's tomes are over 500 pages each, while the Tractatus is only around 70. The Tractatus may be short, but it is dense, and one of the reasons for that is its highly unusual style and structure. The work contains almost no arguments, examples, or direct proofs, but rather consists of propositions that Wittgenstein assumes will be taken as self-evident and that the reasoning behind them will be implicit. One of the most common words used by writers to describe the Tractatus is oracular, in virtue of its declarative tone and enigmatic content. The Tractatus does not have the long-winded, rambling sentences of many continental philosophers like Heidegger. In fact, its compact writing style and rigorously ordered structure make it appear misleadingly direct and easy to grasp. But it is because of how much is not said in the Tractatus that it is so hard to interpret. The Tractatus' structure is dynamic, and in fact its afterlife on the internet has, I believe, given it a form that Wittgenstein himself would be highly pleased with. This is the hypertext website version, which I will link in the description. It shows us exactly how the work is structured. The Tractatus consists of 7 propositions as its overarching skeleton. These are: 1. The world is all that is the case. 2. What is the case, a fact, is the existence of states of affairs. 3. A logical picture of facts is a thought. 4. A thought is a proposition with a sense. 5. A proposition is a truth function of elementary propositions. An elementary proposition is a truth function of itself. 6. The general form of a truth function is bar p bar xi negation of bar xi. This is the general form of a proposition. 7. What we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence. These 7 propositions are, in its shortest form, the Tractatus. But what do they mean? Each one, with the exception of 7, is joined by several sub-hierarchies of sub-propositions and clauses. For an example of how this looks, I will show the position of statement 4.0312. where Wittgenstein refers to something he calls his quote-unquote fundamental idea. Beginning, we have proposition 4. Proposition 4 has 5 points of clarification, 4.1 to 4.5. 4.1 to 4.5 all have sub-points of clarification, as well as proposition 4 itself. The ones that follow 4 itself are labeled as 4.0. These can be expanded to 4.01 to 4.06. 4.03 has 2 points of clarification, 4.031 and 4.032. 4.031 also has 2 points of clarification, 4.0311 and 4.0312. So the hierarchy of importance from basic to more elaboratory. Each digit space represents a further level of elaboration and specificity, from 4 to 4.03 to 4.031 to 4.0312. So this is the second elaboration of the first elaboration of the third elaboration of the elaboration of the primary statement 4. This might sound confusing at first, but as long as you remember that each digit is the number of elaboration points on the digit directly before it, you will be able to see what place these propositions have in the Tractatus. An even more dynamic way of figuring this out is just messing around with the hypertext website, which can give you a great idea of how to visualize it and how to see the structure of the Tractatus in effect. But that won't make it necessarily easy to understand, of course. The Tractatus was completed in 1918, but not published until 1921. The reason was simple: no one understood it. Wittgenstein, upon returning from war in 1918, presented his work to Frege and to Russell, perhaps the two men who would be most likely to understand it of anyone in the world. Frege found it incomprehensible. Russell, after a careful and thorough reading side by side with Wittgenstein, felt that he understood it, though he found many of its ideas troubling and difficult to reconcile. Wittgenstein desired to have the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus published, but no one would accept it, saying that it was too hard to understand. Wittgenstein believed his work had a purity in its simplicity, and that any further explanation of his terms, the arguments he was responding to, etc., would destroy the beauty and integrity of the work. Met with this situation, Russell offered to write an introduction to the work that would give readers a grasp on what philosophical positions Wittgenstein was responding to, and in general what his point was with his work. This was acceptable to publishers, this was acceptable to publishers, and with Russell's clarification, they allowed the work to be published. However, Wittgenstein fought them the whole way, because he felt that Russell's introduction had fundamentally misunderstood the aim of his project, and thus was more harmful than helpful. With this in mind, I try not to rely on Russell's interpretation too much, but I will consult his introduction to better set the stage of what philosophical ideas Wittgenstein is responding to. This is something that Russell's introduction remains useful for. With that in mind, we will move to the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus itself, and see if perhaps we can grasp what Russell and Frege apparently never did. Even after reading many commentaries and analyses of this work, I still think that the SparkNotes page on it, of all things, is one of the best. SparkNotes uses a certain division for the structure of the Tractatus, which I think is very accurate and useful, though as you will see, it doesn't exactly match Wittgenstein's own division. So without hesitation, let's jump into this supposed solution for all philosophical problems. Proposition 1. The world is all that is the case. Proposition 2. What is the case, a fact, is the existence of states of affairs. 2.01. A state of affairs, a state of things, is a combination of objects, things. Wittgenstein begins the Tractatus by mapping out a kind of ontology, or idea of all that exists, and three terms repeatedly occur: facts, states of affairs, and objects. There is no direct definition or example of any of these, which makes this dissection somewhat frustrating and difficult to parse. Regardless, there is a kind of hierarchy among the three. The world consists of facts, which are made up of the existence or non-existence of states of affairs, which are combinations of objects. While we don't have Wittgenstein's definition of these things, and thus should be somewhat hesitant with providing our own, this section will be easier to understand if we give an example of what a fact, state of affairs, and object could be. A fact is something that could be true or false and consists of states of affairs. A state of affairs is called an atomic fact in the Ogden translation of the Tractatus, which helps clarify its meaning somewhat. A state of affairs is a fact so simple that its truth or falsehood has no bearing on the truth or falsehood of any other state of affairs. To use an example from Bertrand Russell's introduction, the fact Socrates is a wise Athenian could depend on the state of affairs Socrates is wise and Socrates is an Athenian. Or, to use an example from SparkNotes, a fact could be that my house is safe from burglars, which is dependent on the existence of states of affairs, such as the only pair of keys to my house being in my pocket. And perhaps keys or pockets could be objects. Of course, states of affairs and objects are difficult to think of examples for, because they would need to be independent of anything else and irreducible to anything else, which seems nearly impossible to think of. Facts and states of affairs exist in what he calls logical space. What does this mean? Logical space is the realm of everything that is logically possible, both that which is true, say for example, again from SparkNotes, Ottawa is the capital of Canada, or what is false, say, Toronto is the capital of Canada. Toronto is not the capital of Canada, so the latter of these two facts is not true, but there is nothing illogical about it, so it can exist in logical space. On the other hand, some combinations of objects are logically impossible, such as love is purple. Love cannot have a color ascribed to it, so it cannot combine with purple, and therefore this pseudo-fact does not exist in logical space. SparkNotes has a very helpful analogy for this. Visualize logical space as a grid of light bulbs. Each light bulb represents a possible state of affairs. Behind the grid, there are power sources representing objects, each with wires, different kinds of wires for different kinds of objects. These wires connect with light bulbs that have sockets fit for that kind of object. Each light bulb has a number of different wires plugging into it, just as each state of affairs is made up of a number of different objects. Depending on how the wires combine, they will either conflict with each other and prevent the light bulb from receiving power, or combine and turn it on. So, the wires for capital of Canada and Toronto would conflict and keep that light bulb dark, therefore untrue, whereas capital of Canada and Ottawa would combine and turn that light bulb on, therefore making it true. One problem still remains though. What exactly are these objects that he keeps mentioning? I give examples of capital of Canada or Toronto as something that could be an object, although in truth capital of Canada is probably too complex because it depends on a number of social, political definitions of what counts as a capital. Canada could be a little more direct in that it refers to a particular state of land, but these still seem somewhat reducible. It's hard to say, therefore, what an object is. The next section continues in discussing objects more precisely, but Wittgenstein first introduces a few important things about them here. A state of affairs is a combination of objects, and every object has a logical form that determines how and in what states of affairs it can occur. So, for example, if love were an object, the logical form of love would dictate that it can occur in certain ways in some propositions, such as love is the opposite of hate, but not in others, i.e., love is purple. Furthermore, Wittgenstein makes it clear that objects don't just happen to have the possibility of constituting states of affairs. That is, they aren't just substances that happen to exist and can potentially be combined in states of affairs. He says that constituting states of affairs is actually the essence of objects. An object's essence is, in a philosophical definition, the thing that defines it or makes it what it is. So in this sense, Wittgenstein seems to say that the essence of any object is not that certain properties hold of it, but the possibility of certain kinds of properties holding of it. He uses an analogy to get at this point in 2.0131. Visual objects need not be any specific color, but they need to have some color. They exist in a so-called color space. A tone must have some pitch existing in a sound space. Objects need not exist in any specific state of affairs, but they must exist in some states of affairs, so they exist in logical space. With this in mind, the light bulb metaphor helps to, if you'll excuse the pun, illuminate several important upshots of Wittgenstein's ontology. 1. That states of affairs are mutually independent. Any light bulb can be lit or unlit without affecting any other light bulb. 2. That the essence of an object is its possibility of existing in certain states of affairs. The significance of the power source lies in which light bulbs it plugs into and how it does so. And 3. The world is the totality of facts, not of things. The world is the totality of the lit light bulbs, not the totality of the objects that exist as power sources. And if we accept this, what follows is a massive limit to the meaningful statements we can make about the ontology of the world. We cannot say that certain things exist or don't exist. We can only state facts that relate these things to others. For example, if we have an ontological question, such as whether or not unicorns exist, the only way to answer it is to list all the facts about unicorns. We can say that there has never been a sighting of a unicorn, or that unicorns have only been encountered in fiction. But it doesn't even make sense to exclude unicorns from our ontology, because it's an ontology of facts, not of things. The only way we can say that unicorns don't exist is by saying that there are no true facts asserting anything about unicorns as flesh and blood creatures. This first section seems to be a kind of ontology that sets the stage for the rest of the Tractatus, and it seems to propose a form of what has come to be known as logical atomism. This term originates from Bertrand Russell, who seems to have developed these ideas after the early influence of Wittgenstein, although the two of them held very different views about what logical atomism ultimately meant. Logical atomism, like physical atomism, holds that there are fundamental, indivisible particulars that our experience can be analyzed down into. Russell analyzes the world into a similar threefold division as Wittgenstein, with atomic propositions corresponding to facts, and atomic facts corresponding to states of affairs, but instead of simply objects, he sees the constituents of an atomic fact to be particulars and universals. A particular is something that applies to one atomic fact, like a name or a specified object, while a universal gives particular qualities through things like color, shape, disposition, etc. Wittgenstein doesn't break objects into particulars and universals, though, because he sees all states of affairs as composed of objects and that they are true or false independent of one another. Russell's idea of particulars and universals denies this independence because it requires objects to be seen as shared or excluded between different facts. 2.02 Objects are simple. 2.03 In a state of affairs, objects fit into one another like the links of a chain. 2.04 The totality of existing states of affairs is the world. 2.05 The totality of existing states of affairs also determines which states of affairs do not exist. 2.06 The existence and non-existence of states of affairs is reality. We call the existence of states of affairs a positive fact, and their non-existence a negative fact. Again, Wittgenstein continues with his discussion of objects and states of affairs, but we never get an exact definition. From his language, we can tell that objects are the simplest kind of thing that there are, and states of affairs are the simplest kind of facts that there are. E.g., neither can be further analyzed or reduced, because they form the fundamental basis of the ontology. So, while I used various examples for objects in the above section, in truth those can't be what Wittgenstein means by objects. Objects can't be things like tables, chairs, or keys, or capitals that I used in the above section, since those can be divided into smaller parts. But the problem with this is thinking of something that exists that can't be further analyzed and reduced. Does anything like that exist? There are three ideas we can consider for what he means by object, but this point remains very unsettled. 1. Objects are the basic elements of sense data. This follows Russell, who argued that we experience particulars and universals as elements of sense data with which we are directly acquainted. But this has one problem. Wittgenstein says that objects are things that can combine in basic states of affairs as being either true or false, whereas a speck in the visual field could be many different colors, and it seems hard to see how we could apply truth or falsity to it. Also, if he truly did mean sense data when he talked about objects, he probably would have followed Russell and simply said so. 2. Objects are not as specific as sense data, but are a basic underlying structure to the universe. They are the basic building blocks of reality, even if we cannot determine precisely what they are. 3. Objects have no independent being at all. Wittgenstein says repeatedly that objects only exist within states of affairs, that the essence of objects is to combine in states of affairs, and that the world is made up of states of affairs and not objects. Objects do not exist as the basic building blocks of reality, but are only given in the context of states of affairs, under this interpretation. Since Wittgenstein asserts that the world consists of states of affairs and not objects, where does he get the idea of there being simple objects in the first place? In his words, quote, "Objects form the substance of the world, therefore they cannot be compound," unquote, 2.021. What is this substance he's referring to? Substance has a long history in rationalist thought, from Aristotle to Descartes to Kant. In their thinking, substance is an underlying, unchanging, and indestructible nature of the world. It is what stays the same even if everything else changes. Wittgenstein's concept of substance must be somewhat in line with this. In 2.02, he says that objects are simple, and in 2.027, he says that, quote, "Objects, the unalterable, and the subsistent are one and the same," unquote. But despite being unchanging and indestructible, his objects are nothing but empty logical forms. They don't reveal anything about the world until they are combined in states of affairs. There is an unchanging, indestructible, and necessary logical form to the universe for Wittgenstein, but everything that is the case depends on states of affairs, which are entirely contingent. So, if what is the case is completely contingent, what does this logical form of the world consist of? To understand this, remember the light bulb analogy of objects, states of affairs, and facts. The logical form determines how these are created. For example, purple is a color, and thus can only be used in contexts where a color word is called for. What kind of a color purple is, what sorts of things in the world are purple, etc., are contingent facts that could be otherwise. But the fact that purple is a color is a necessary aspect of the logical form of purple. Objects, for Wittgenstein, have internal and external properties. The internal properties are the logical form of the object, i.e., what kind of object it is and how it can combine with other objects in states of affairs. The external properties are what is true of it, what kind of states of affairs it does in fact occur in. The internal properties are a part of logical form and thus remain true no matter what. There will always be these objects with these logical forms, and those are the substance of the world. We might be able to imagine worlds other than this one, but not worlds with a different logical form from this one. For example, as SparkNotes says, we could imagine a world where horses speak or where grass was pink, but not a world without space, time, or color. If the world had no substance or logical form, then purple is a color would be a contingent fact, just like that lampshade is purple. But purple being a color cannot be contingent because that would mean it could have been otherwise, and could have been something like a number. And that would be nonsense. He says that if the world had no substance, then whether a proposition was true would depend on whether another proposition was true, in 2.0211. That would mean that a proposition like "that lampshade is purple" couldn't be true or false on its own. And, as we know from the above section, all facts and states of affairs are true or false on their own with no influence from any other. Although there are objects with internal properties that are always the same, we need to note that this says nothing about what is actually the case. The internal properties of yellow and red are indistinguishable, since both are colors, so they can both occur in the same kind of states of affairs. They have the same logical form in that way. The only way yellow and red are distinguishable is by their external properties, what happens to be true of them, what things do happen to be yellow or red. And this is why Wittgenstein never gives an example of what an object is. There is nothing to be said about objects. Asking what is an object is like asking, what does everything have in common? And the only answer that he can give for this is that everything shares a logical form that allows it to occur in states of affairs. Objects are the simplest, most general things that there are, and the only thing that all things have in common is that we can say something about them. As we discussed above, it's not just that objects have certain internal properties, it's actually the internal properties that determine their essence. And because these properties are constituents of the objects themselves, there is no need for an external metaphysical glue of sorts to put objects together in a state of affairs. As he puts it, quote, "In a state of affairs, objects fit into one another like the links of a chain," unquote, 2.03. The objects combine on their own with no need for external laws or rules to hold them together, no kind of metaphysical glue, because the properties of being able to combine, their logical form, are the constituents of the objects. And with the status of objects made clearer, we can return to what was already established. Some states of affairs are the case, and will be called positive facts, and some are not, and will be called negative facts. Every state of affairs is the case or not the case independently of any other, and the world is the sum total of those states of affairs that are the case. 2.1. We picture facts to ourselves. 2.2. A picture has logico-pictorial form in common with what it depicts. Proposition 3. A logical picture of facts is a thought. 3.1. In a proposition, a thought finds an expression that can be perceived by the senses. This section shifts the Tractatus from its ontology to a discussion of how we make sense and communicate what there is via language, thought, and representation. However, we should note that the discussion of thought in this section is not concerned with psychology, epistemology, or anything of that nature. Wittgenstein wants to discuss how things are, not how we perceive them to be, and in fact expresses a sort of concern over Russell and Frege for over-epistemologizing and over-psychologizing of logic in much of the Tractatus. With that in mind, Wittgenstein's concern is not how thoughts work or where they come from, it is what their form is. And this form is the same form as everything else, logical form. In 3.03, he claims that we cannot think anything illogical. This means that we cannot think things that have no sense, i.e., things that have objects that cannot combine, such as the number 2 is purple. This wouldn't have the correct logical form, and thus it's not even clear what that thought would be, so it doesn't really even count as a thought. So what about things that do have logical form? How do the true or false states of affairs that make up the world relate to our thoughts of them? Here, Wittgenstein provides an ingenious answer that has become known as the picture theory, according to which propositions are logical pictures of facts. What is a proposition? A proposition is a representation of a fact, but note that it's not as concrete as something like a sentence. We might say that a proposition is the meaning behind the sentence. If I translate the same sentence into a number of different languages, or think it in my head, or express it through sign language, etc., etc., the same meaning that is conveyed behind them all will be the proposition. We could say that a sentence is what we utter, but a proposition is what is said. Wittgenstein would call a sentence a propositional sign, or in other words, a written or spoken manifestation of a proposition. And propositions are logical pictures of facts. The word picture in the Tractatus is somewhat technical, being both literally and metaphorically used. He isn't so much giving the word picture a new usage as much as expanding its current one. The word he uses in German is Bild, which means picture or image in the visual sense that we normally think of, but also somewhat broadly can be used for any kind of appearance or form, and it is often used this way in compound words. Wittgenstein says that, quote, we picture facts to ourselves, unquote, 2.1, meaning that conceiving of something is a matter of picturing it to ourselves. If something can be the case due to having a correct logical form, i.e. existing in logical space, such as true or false facts, we can conceive of it, and thus make what Wittgenstein calls a logical picture of it, or a representation of it that uses logical form. We represent facts to ourselves by means of pictures. He says that the elements of a picture correspond to the elements of a fact, meaning the objects that constitute it. The genesis of this idea came to Wittgenstein during his service in World War I. He happened upon a newspaper article about a court case revolving around a traffic accident. The way the accident actually happened was difficult to explain without a visual aid, so the court used small models of the buildings, cars, etc. to display what happened. The idea struck Wittgenstein because people in the court could understand what was the case in virtue of a shared form. The models of the cars and buildings only have their form in common with the real cars and buildings, but because of that, they have the same limits of representation and can show what is possible. For example, we can use the models to represent one car on its side, one car on top of the other, one broken in half, one on the roof of a building, etc., whether these are true to what actually happened or not. However, one cannot represent something logically impossible with them, such as two cars existing in the same exact place at the same time. In Wittgenstein's own words, we can display something that is contrary to the laws of physics but not to the laws of geometry. What this is a metaphor for would be something like the following. We could use those models to display one car floating in the air, even if this is not in accordance with our physical laws, but not a car existing outside of space, or being in two different places at the same time, etc. This metaphor does not appear in the Tractatus proper, but it is a very helpful illustration of the concept of the picture theory. A picture helps us apprehend a fact by having a similar logical form, just as the models in real cars and buildings do. He isn't talking just about visual pictures, but any kind of shared form that allows us to picture something, or imagine it, comprehend it, apprehend it to ourselves. So what he would call these are logical pictures. There is a direct correspondence between logical pictures and facts. For every fact that exists, positive or negative, there is only one logical picture that corresponds to it. We can tell which fact a logical picture depicts because the picture shares the same logical form as the fact. Just in the way that a visual picture illustrates something visual by having the same form with that thing that it depicts, i.e., a face having the same objects on it like eyes, nose, mouth, in roughly the same order on a picture. Wittgenstein illustrates this at 2.1512 to 2.15121 with the analogy of a ruler laid against an object to measure its length. The ruler and object have nothing in common except that they both have length, but because of this commonality we can relate the one to the other. There only needs to be one point of contact to relate two different objects to one another. Because both a ruler and a measured object have length, it is possible to relate different aspects of the objects to graduated lines and numbers on the ruler. Similarly, because a logical picture and a fact have logical form in common, we can relate elements of the fact to those of the logical picture. Note, however, that since logical pictures represent logical form, they determine what is possible. They only determine what light bulbs could exist and not necessarily which ones happen to be turned on. To use our earlier metaphor, a picture is either true or false, and there is no picture that is true a priori. We can only know if it is true or not by comparing it with reality and deciding if the sense of the picture, that is, the situation that the picture represents, agrees with what happens to be the case or not. See 2.221 and 2.223. At 2.172, he says that a picture cannot depict its pictorial form. The picture may have the same logical form as a fact, but it cannot depict that logical form proper. Rather, the logical form shows itself in the picture. What does this mean? If we remember the opening sections, we said that the only things we can say about the world are individual facts, and that facts exist in virtue of their logical form. So facts are things which can be said, while form is that which can be shown. And just as there is only one matching logical picture for each and every fact, there will be one and only thought matching each logical picture. Wittgenstein's third proposition says this directly enough as, quote, the logical picture of the facts is the thought, unquote, Proposition 3. That is, a thought is a logical picture of a possible situation. Because thoughts share the same logical form as logical pictures and facts, it is possible for us to have a false thought, but not an illogical one. To use an analogy of geometry, we could display a circle of any circumference regardless of whether that circle truly existed or not, but never one that contradicted the laws of space. See 3.032. And just as in geometry we cannot represent a figure that contradicts the laws of space, so in our thoughts we cannot represent a thought that contradicts the laws of logic. And to complete the chain from fact to logical picture to thought, we represent thoughts by means of propositions. 3.1. As I discussed above, a proposition is the meaning that we express in sentences, thoughts, etc. It is the sense that is conveyed through propositional signs, as Wittgenstein calls them, such as speech, writing, or body language. And like a picture, a proposition represents a possible state of affairs by sharing a form in common with it, i.e., its elements being arranged in a similar way. Therefore, a sentence has a sense, but a random string of words strung together does not, because it has no structure of internal coherence in the way they are arranged. This means that sentences can picture propositions because they share the same logical form as them. What exactly he means by this is not very clear, but, for example, if we had the proposition Othello loves Desdemona, it could display that state of affairs in a sentence by virtue of Othello being at the beginning, Desdemona being at the end, and loves being in the center, although Wittgenstein is silent about exactly how this would manifest itself in a sentence. Regardless, sentences and other such propositional signs share the same logical picture as propositions, which share the same logical picture as thoughts, which share the same logical picture as facts. And there is an upshot to this in relation to logic in 3.1432. Quote, instead of the complex sign ARB says that A stands in relation R to B, we ought to put that A stands to B in a certain relation says that ARB, unquote. Here, ARB stands as a logical representation of a statement that says that A stands in relation R to B. The proposition does not say what relation holds between its elements, Rather, that relation is what makes the proposition sayable in the first place. Remember that facts are something that we can say, while their logical form is something that is shown. As facts can exist in virtue of a logical form that is shown, so the proposition can only show the logical form of relation between its elements. It displays it. This distinction of saying versus showing will have profound implications in the next section. 3.2. In a proposition, a thought can be expressed in such a way that the elements of the propositional sign correspond to the objects of the thought. 3.3. Only propositions have sense. Only in the nexus of a proposition does a name have meaning. 3.4. A proposition determines a place in logical space. The existence of this logical place is guaranteed by the mere existence of the constituents, by the existence of the proposition with a sense. 3.5. A propositional sign, applied and thought out, is a thought. This section, when I first read the Tractatus, was the first area that I got lost in, and it's one of the first where the engagement with Frege and Russell is much more direct, and is much more technically concerned with the representation of propositions in logical calculus. For that reason, this section will be nearly incomprehensible without some background on Frege and Russell's work in this field. Here, Wittgenstein assumes that we have knowledge of two closely related areas of Frege's and Russell's thought, denoting phrases in semiotics and set theory in logic and mathematics. Though not quite chronological, the best place to find an opening into this highly technical and complicated field of cross-disciplinary thought is in a short and paradigmatic essay published by Russell in 1905 entitled On Denoting. This work has clear connections to the Tractatus in that it too is interested in the logical form of propositions and how we apprehend them, and especially how this happens in language, which is the same concern of Wittgenstein's in this section. Like Frege, Russell realized that the subject-predicate form of grammar, i.e., x is y, masks the true logical form of a proposition as we might write it out in logical notation. To clarify this, rather than subjects and predicates, Frege and Russell read sentences as being composed of functions and variable placeholders. For example, the sentence, "all horses are mammals," is a function of the variable x. For all x, if x is a horse, then x is a mammal. It might look like a simple x is y, subject predicate on its surface, i.e. all horses, x, are, is, y, mammals, but it actually conveys something of a very different form. It's not talking about all horses as one object being something. It's saying, for all x, if x is a horse, then x is a mammal. And what Russell wants to show in On Denoting is that this can be used for much more than just specificity. It can be used, in fact, to solve philosophical problems. And Russell presents just such a solution. In a classical logical framework, all propositions can be judged as either true or false. Something must be the case or not be the case. But how can we do this for propositions that refer to things that don't exist? For example, let's take the sentence, "The present king of France is bald." France, being a democracy, has no king in the present day, so there is no such person as a present king of France. So we can't look at that individual to find an answer. Furthermore, it refers to a thing that doesn't exist, so how can it even be comprehensible to us in the first place? Certainly, we can understand what the phrase present king of France means enough to know that there isn't one, at the very least, but how can we do that without a real object to compare it to? Frege said that in cases like this, we have to admit that some propositions like this one are simply neither true or false. But Russell is uncomfortable with this idea, as it denies a basic logical axiom, that a proposition must only be true or false. Russell thus comes up with an ingenious way to show how we can still comprehend the sentence's meaning, and thus establish it as true or false. Remember how the sentence, "all horses are mammals," appears to say something in the form "x is y," when it really says something more complex, i.e. for all x, if x is a horse, then x is a mammal? The sentence, "the present king of France is bald," is of the same variety, but has an even more complicated form. Now, the issue with this sentence is that it refers to an object called the present king of France that doesn't really exist. So we cannot establish if anything is true or false about it. A comprehensible form of this sentence will thus not have an object called present king of France. And Russell does this precisely when he explains the sentence, "the present king of France is bald," is actually exclaiming three things, none of which have the non-existent object, the present king of France, in them. 1. There is an x such that x is currently the king of France, i.e. there is a present king of France. 2. For any x and y, if x is currently the king of France and y is currently the king of France, then x equals y. This is a complicated way of essentially establishing that there is only one king of France. And 3, for every x that is currently the king of France, x is bald. If we write this in logical notation, it would look like this. There is an x such that x is the king of France, and if there is a y such that it is the and for y, if there is a y such that it is the present king of France, then y equals x, and x is bald. We can deduce that the number 1 of these three propositions is thus false, and because of that, the entire proposition is false. And in order to say that the present king of France is not bald, this is still somewhat of a problem because it seems to presuppose the existence of an entity called present king of France. So, instead of writing, there is an x such that x is the king of France, and for y, if y is the king of France, and then it is the case that y equals x, and it is not the case that x is bald, we would write, it is not the case that there is an x such that x is the king of France, and for y, if y is the king of France, then y equals x, and x is bald. The second one denies the entire proposition without making us presuppose the existence of the non-existent entity in order to say something, in order to say that it is false. This ability to analyze the form of a proposition can make quantifier logic possible and thus allow open formulas for general analysis, i.e., there exists an x such that, or for all x. And any given function will allow for a number of different variables. For example, there are many values of x that will satisfy the function x is a horse, such as Mr. Ed, or Pegasus, or that animal in the petting zoo. For Frege, all values of x that satisfy the function x is a horse is the extension of the concept is a horse, i.e. all horses. Russell follows Frege in defining sets or classes of things that satisfy a certain function as sets or classes. For example, the set of all horses is the set of all objects satisfying the function x is a horse. And for the sake of completeness in logical analysis, we should be able to make sets of anything, such as the set of all prime numbers, or the set of all vegetables beginning with R, etc. This might all seem well and fine, and so far it is. But because of this, there must also be able to be sets of sets, Russell says. For example, the set of all sets that have at least one member that begins with the letter A, or the set of all sets with two members, the latter of which Russell would define as the number 2. And if this is the case, there must be sets that contain themselves. For instance, the set of all sets, or the set of all sets that begin with the letter S, and so on. With the possibility of sets containing themselves in mind, there must be a set of all sets that contain themselves as members, and a set of all sets that do not contain themselves as members. But think over this for a moment. We said that the set of all sets would have to contain itself by definition, and this is acceptable. But does the set of all sets that do not contain themselves contain itself? A close consideration will reveal that there can be no answer that does not lead to a contradiction. If it does not contain itself, it must be a member of its own set, and thus contain itself. This is known as Russell's paradox, and since it is derived from the most basic laws of Frege's logic, it was devastating to his entire career. Russell, as troubling as this discovery was rarely one to offer a negative critique without making a positive proposal in place of it. In order to save the basic laws of logic that he relied on as much as Frege did, Russell came up with a theory of types. According to this theory, sets have different orders. So the first order of sets can only contain objects as members. The second order of sets could only contain objects and first-order sets, and so on. Therefore, we wouldn't have danger of a set trying to contain itself and wouldn't run into this problem. And we would need to invent a symbolism to differentiate the symbols for objects from those for first-order sets, etc. However, many, including Russell himself to some degree, had to recognize that this was in the end more of a clever workaround than a true attempt to solve the paradoxical nature of the problem at its core. This is where Wittgenstein shifts his discussion to the logical properties of language and representation, and in doing so offers an ingenious solution to Russell's paradox. But we have to see exactly how Wittgenstein sees language to understand quite how. Our everyday speech features complex objects that can be analyzed into simpler parts via definitions. If I don't know what a word like opprobrious means, someone can define it for me in simple words. But there are simple symbols, those for names, that cannot be further defined. They are fully analyzed. The meaning of a name in a fully analyzed proposition is the object it refers to, 3.203. Remember that Wittgenstein does not define exactly what objects are, which makes this somewhat difficult to follow. But we can have some idea of what he means if we imagine them as something that cannot be further analyzed, something that relates directly to the thing it names. But this seems impossible. A quick opening of the dictionary will reveal that there doesn't seem to be any name that we can't define, which, according to his definition, it would have to be if it relates directly to the thing it names. But are dictionary definitions really definitions in the first place? Wittgenstein would say no. Names are too simple to be defined, so instead of saying what they mean, we have to show what they mean. And thinking about a dictionary definition will illustrate this nicely. So-called definitions in a dictionary generally illuminate a word's meaning by pointing us to what kind of sentences it is used in, rather than some kind of eternal logical form. Wittgenstein would call this kind of definition an elucidation. And this rests on one primary assertion of Wittgenstein's, that a sign's meaning is its use in propositions. Before, Wittgenstein has made clear that we know the nature of objects based on what states of affairs they appear in. The same is true of signs, that is, things that have a sense that we use to represent ideas, facts, words, sentences, ideas, etc. Names, words, etc. are all meaningless outside of the propositions they can occur in. If our language of signs was perfect, the signs we use to express propositions and their variables would always be completely clear, so that we are never confused about their meaning. 3.32. But natural language is never perfectly logical. We often use the same sign in different ways, or different signs in the same way, and this makes the logic of our language hard to see. For example, as Wittgenstein shows in 3.323, the word is can be used in three completely logically distinct ways. It can be used as a copula, in the sentence John is tall, or T of J. It can be used as a sign of identity in the sentence John is John, or J equals J. Or it can be used as an existential quantification in the sentence there is a person named John. In the logical form, there is an X and J of X. A sign like is has no meaning apart from its use. To get an idea of what he means by this, look at the proposition, the hat is on the table. This is a function of the X is on the Y, and hat and table are two values that can be used in this function. The fact that hat and table can be used as values for the function doesn't tell us anything particularly, but the fact that hat and table can be used as values for the function while 2 and purple cannot, i.e., the hat is on the table, can convey a meaning while the 2 is on the purple cannot. That tells us something about the meaning of these signs. So the meaning of signs like these are determined by their use, by what situations and with what objects they can be used. And this is why Russell's paradox does not occur. Russell, Wittgenstein says, makes the mistake of giving his signs a meaning of their own. 3.331. There's no need to posit types by recognizing that a proposition that makes a statement about itself is not being used in the same way as the first proposition. A function cannot be used to talk about itself, meaning a set cannot contain itself, because this would be giving it two different uses, and thus it wouldn't really be talking about itself to begin with. This is hard to understand until we look at it in logical notation. Let's say we have a proposition, or a set, f of x, and then we have a proposition making a statement about itself, or a set contained within itself, f of x. The two have completely different logical forms, and because their use is different, their meaning is different as well. And since meaning is determined by use, they are used in different ways and not the same function. And clearly the logical form of these cover different ground. They are as different here as the is of the copula and the one of a sign of identity is. So Russell's paradox does not occur. This solving of Russell's paradox is quite noteworthy, but in truth it is more of a side note to what Wittgenstein's real point in this section is. He is claiming that the sense of a proposition is entirely internal to the proposition itself. The elements of a proposition are related only to one another and not to anything external to them. The propositions, the hat is on the table, and the book is on the shelf, are identical in all their essential features, because they're both forms of the x is on the y, and they vary only in the accidental fact of what values are given to their variables. Hats and tables, or books and shelves, etc., are not essential to the proposition. That the hat is on the table is true, or the book is on the shelf is false, for example, tells us nothing about the proposition, because it's just something that would happen to be the case of the world, not an a priori truth. So these variables are not essential to the proposition's meaning. However, the fact that they are the kind of values that can be used does help us elucidate the meaning of the proposition. So, while the x is on the y does not have a meaning that can be said, i.e. we cannot say its logical form, the kinds of values we use for x and y helps us to figure out exactly how this proposition stands in logical space. 3.3421. This is contrary to Frege, who claims that every proposition is in truth a complex name for one of two objects that exist in a kind of higher Platonic realm, namely the true and the false. Wittgenstein's claim is that no proposition is true or false by virtue of some metaphysical sense or a priori truth, but has an internal meaning in virtue of what kinds of values can fill out its variables, and that this is entirely internal and a priori. Proposition 4. A thought is a proposition with a sense. 4.1. Propositions represent the existence and non-existence of states of affairs. 4.11. The totality of true propositions is the whole of natural science, or the whole corpus of the natural sciences. In the above section, we established that the sense of a proposition is internal to the proposition itself, while the meaning of a name is external to the name. The meaning of a name is the thing that it denotes, and there is nothing in the name itself that can tell us what object it denotes. Rather, we learn the meaning of a name by observing how and in reference to what it is used. This is why in the section above, Wittgenstein made it clear that the meaning of names is their use. The meaning of a name lies outside the name, and this meaning must be made clear by means of elucidations, as we established with the way that dictionaries, etc., point us to how words are used. And the totality of propositions is the sum total of what we are capable of expressing in language, 4.001. However, our everyday language, while possessing a logical structure of its own, rarely, if ever, makes its logical form obvious, and this leads to all kind of confusion. And the above picture theory we discussed explains how the sense of a proposition is internal, in the sense that it doesn't require elucidations like a name does. A proposition and the reality that it depicts share a logical form, and that is enough for the one to depict the other. There is nothing external to the proposition that can make the connection between the proposition and what it depicts any clearer than it already is. The analogy Wittgenstein uses for this is of sheet music and a symphony. If you can read music, you don't need anything else to help you translate written notes into sounds besides the shared form of the notes and music. In fact, it isn't even possible for anything else to help you. And it is the same with a proposition. Its shared form with the picture of reality is how we come to understand a proposition, and nothing can make that connection more clear than it already is. Do we have to follow certain rules in order to understand the sense of a proposition? Are there rules on how to interpret these rules? Wittgenstein's later work is very deeply concerned about the nature of rule following and offers much more thorough consideration of the subject, but in the Tractatus, Wittgenstein simply says that elucidations like rules and interpretations for a proposition sense are not necessary when the common logical form shows itself. This is a nice way of avoiding the infinite regress of needing rules to interpret a proposition, then rules to interpret those rules, and so on and so forth. There is no need for them because the logical form shows itself without being said, and thus without being interpreted, or followed as a rule. This elimination of rules also continues with the central thesis that logical relations are shown instead of said. Wittgenstein thinks that we not only do not need to, but actually are not able to say what the sense of a proposition is, because this shows itself by means of sharing a logical form with the reality it depicts. And this logical form stands in place of speech for us. It is only because of the commonality of logical form that we can understand speech. Wittgenstein also wants to emphasize that the truth value of a proposition has no bearing on its sense. A proposition makes a picture of the world, whether this is true or false, and we can draw logical inferences from that picture simply in virtue of the fact that it can be expressed. This means that logical constants, connectives like is and not, etc., that enter into logical propositions cannot be represented or talked about in language. To illustrate this, Wittgenstein uses the example of two propositions, P and not P. These obviously have the same sense, since not P means the same thing as P. And this is because the sign not in truth doesn't mean anything. He equates it to a punctuation sign, or to the parentheses or line numbers that a proposition occurs in. The propositions P and not P might have opposite senses, but they display the same situation. One of them simply says that the picture presented is the case, and one that it is not, but the picture remains the same in both. To call attention, perhaps, to the importance of the claim that logical constants cannot be represented in propositions, Wittgenstein goes as far as to proclaim it as his quote-unquote fundamental idea in 4.0132. Indeed, the distinction of saying and showing that so much of this book seems to base itself on is most clearly formulated here. Note that the book's fundamental point requires a background of ontological and linguistic bases in the first three propositions, but that the point itself is not about language or the world, but about logic. So, logical connectives like is and not, or these constants, don't have any meaning because they cannot be represented or talked about in language. But this has an upshot that many will find extreme and troubling. The shared form between propositions and logical form, like those between notes and music, or names and objects, etc., can only be shown and not expressed in language, talked about, or described. What does this mean for Frege and Russell, whose philosophy talked so much about logical inference and logical relations? Simple. That these are all fruitless endeavors that are born from a fundamentally impossible desire. Logic is shown in the way the world is held together, and it is simply not possible for us to say what these workings are or make them clearer in language. And with this, the fundamental point becomes clear, and it becomes obvious just how radically Wittgenstein limits what can be meaningfully said. Propositions for him can only make claims about how things stand in the world, whether true or false, which is the business of natural science. Philosophy, he says, is not at all what people have thought it to be, a series of propositions about the true nature of reality. Thinking that this is the aim of philosophy is what has in fact been the greatest cause of philosophical confusion. 4.003. Philosophy, according to him in 4.112, is rather than this an activity, and its business is of showing rather than saying. Philosophy does not make statements about what is the case in some way that stands outside of reality and the world. It is rather a method of clarifying the logical structure of our propositions, which are so clouded by our everyday language. As Wittgenstein says, philosophy will clarify the propositions of natural science, and therefore by clarifying everything that can be said, will also make clear everything that cannot be said. And no one part of natural science, nothing that can be said about how things stand in the world, is more closely related to philosophy than any other, be it ecology, psychology, evolutionary theory, quantum physics, etc., etc. 4.12. Propositions can represent the whole reality, but they cannot represent what they must have in common with reality in order to be able to represent it, logical form. In order to be able to represent logical form, we should have to be able to station ourselves with propositions somewhere outside logic, that is to say, outside the world. In the last section, we made it clear that propositions can't meaningfully talk about things like logical relations. They can only make statements about how things stand in the world. Propositions can depict all of reality, but they cannot depict the logical form of reality. A proposition can only depict what is external to it, so in order to depict logical form, it would have to do so from a perspective outside of logical space. This is impossible, so rather than depicting logical form, a proposition can only show it. It shows it by virtue of sharing its logical form with the reality that it depicts. And according to him, quote, what can be shown cannot be said, unquote, 4.1212. In this section, Wittgenstein introduces an important distinction between what he calls formal concepts and concepts proper, which follows from the above claim that only propositions that picture states of affairs in the world have meaning. But to truly understand why he distinguishes these, we have to look at the work of Frege that Wittgenstein is responding to. Frege analyzed the logical properties of language and made a distinction between objects and concepts. For example, in a proposition like, "The President of America is a Texan," we have an object and a concept, namely, the object, the President of America, which denotes a specific thing in the world to which we can ascribe properties, and the concept Texan, which denotes a category into which one or more object may fall. We could say that the President of America is a value of the function is a Texan, or for Socrates is an Athenian, that Socrates is a value of the function is an Athenian. And more generally, we can say that in any proposition of the form x is a y, x will represent an object and y will represent a concept. This might seem pretty rock solid so far, but the distinction falls apart immediately when we try to apply it to logical properties themselves. How can we talk about the concept of a horse? We can say things about it, ascribe properties to it, etc., so it must be an object. If we tried to say, the concept of a horse is a concept, it would seem contradictory, since the x in x is a y must always be an object. Thus it would seem there is no true proposition of the form x is a concept. For Wittgenstein, realizing a difference between saying and showing gets rid of this problem, by realizing that logic is something that shows itself and is not something we can talk about. But we have to distinguish between a formal concept and a concept proper to do it. He claims that there are such things as formal or internal properties. These are things that show themselves in a proposition but cannot be spoken about. They are what define the logical structure of an object, state of affairs, or fact. The distinction will look like this in 4.1272. A concept proper can be expressed as a function and can feature in propositions, i.e. x is a horse. A formal concept cannot be spoken about at all, but only show itself, i.e. x is a number. We cannot say that x is a number. That it is a number shows itself by the kinds of propositions it occurs in, and any attempt to use a formal concept in a proposition, such as 2 is a number, purple is a color, etc., etc., will only result in a nonsensical pseudo-proposition. For Wittgenstein, there is actually a fundamental difference between x is a horse and x is a concept. The grammar of these is identical on the surface and fools us into thinking that they are equivalent, but they are absolutely not. Only x is a horse has sense. If Frege is right, and any y in a proposition of the form x is a y is a concept, then the fact that y is a concept is something that shows itself from the place that it holds in the proposition. Any attempt to say something of the form x is a concept will be an attempt to say that which can only be shown, and will thus be no proposition at all, but simply nonsense. Unlike Frege and Russell, Wittgenstein asserts that formal concepts are not represented in logical notation as sets or functions, which is why Russell's paradox does not occur, 4.1272, and that they cannot be introduced in the same way that objects are, 4.12721. That is to say that we can say, there is an x such that, but we cannot say, there is an object such that. Frege and Russell might try to express x is a concept as the function O of x, but Wittgenstein thinks that formal concepts cannot be represented as functions but only as variables. The variable x in the proposition x is a horse signifies an object because it holds the place of an object in the proposition. The x in that proposition can stand for any object, and thus shows its status as an object. So while we cannot talk about objects directly as functions, we can show their existence by what kind of things can take the place of x. And because we cannot talk about formal concepts, we cannot talk about the number of formal objects, or what kinds of formal objects there are. As Wittgenstein says, logical forms are anumerical. These logical forms make no claim to how many there are, or anything concrete at all in the world, which means that we cannot meaningfully talk about philosophical concepts like monism or dualism. Propositions can only talk about objects and states of affairs, and formal concepts have no objects or states of affairs corresponding to them. This is a logical conclusion, but it is extraordinarily harsh. It means that not only can we not make abstract philosophical statements like there is only a single substance, but that even statements like 2 is a number or purple is a color have no sense, since they describe formal properties of concepts or objects. Surely we can understand what someone means when they say 2 is a number, right? But Wittgenstein says no. We only think we understand, because we are being misled by a familiar grammatical structure. To truly test whether a proposition has sense or not, we need to ask what possible situation in the world it represents. And since there is no situation corresponding to 2 is a number, this is nonsense. In the same way, we can't describe an object or a number or a concept or a color. We can only describe things that are colors or objects. If we were asked to draw a horse, we could draw a horse without thinking of any individual horse that is in the world. But if we were asked to draw a number or an object, we could only draw an individual number or object that happens to exist in the world. Now, the more astute listeners will immediately see a problem in this. If we can't make meaningful statements about formal concepts, what do we make of all the propositions of the Tractatus itself? Almost every one of the propositions we've dealt with makes some mention of things like objects, facts, states of affairs, and other such things that certainly don't speak about specific ways things stand in the world like the propositions of natural science would. In fact, it was only by using propositions such as these that we arrived at this distinction between formal concepts and concepts proper in the first place. This tension is only truly dealt with at the end of the Tractatus, so I will ask you to wait until then for us to examine it in full, but keep it in the back of your mind that Wittgenstein is already seeming to pull the rug out from under his own feet in this part of the work. 4.2. The sense of a proposition is its agreement and disagreement with possibilities of existence and non-existence of states of affairs. 4.3. Truth possibilities of elementary propositions mean possibilities of existence and non-existence of states of affairs. 4.4. A proposition is an expression of agreement and disagreement with truth possibilities of elementary propositions. 4.5. It now seems possible to give the most general form, propositional form, that is, to give a description of the propositions of any sign language whatsoever, in such a way that every possible sense can be expressed by a symbol satisfying the description, and every symbol satisfying the description can express a sense, provided that the meanings of the names are suitably chosen. It is clear that only what is essential to the most general propositional form may be included in its description, for otherwise it would not be the most general form. The existence of a general propositional form is proved by the fact that there cannot be a proposition whose form could not have been foreseen, i.e. constructed. The general form of a proposition is, "This is how things stand." Proposition 5. A proposition is a truth function of elementary propositions. An elementary proposition is a truth function of itself. 5.1. Truth functions can be arranged in series. That is the foundation of the theory of probability. Above, we have seen that all there is to say about reality is propositions that happen to be the case or not, that these stand independent of one another, and that these can only depict possible situations that are in the world, and not formal concepts that are abstract, because the latter can only show their form. There are no logical constants like and, not, etc. that hold them together as a kind of logical glue, but only objects that combine, as Wittgenstein says, like links in a chain. And these combine in certain ways. And in this section, Wittgenstein explains exactly how these combinations can convey logical form all on their own. Earlier, he said that no picture or fact is a priori true. We can only know that something is the case by comparing it with reality, and that itself is the entirety of the meaning of the proposition. That means that if we know when something is true and when it is false, we know what the proposition means in its entirety. So, we can say Ottawa is the capital of Canada is true or false only or we know what that means only in virtue of knowing when it would be true and when it would be false. Any proposition for Wittgenstein consists of one or more elementary propositions, each of which can be true or false independently of any other. In my reading through the Tractatus, I always got confused at first in this section with all its talk of propositions and elementary propositions. But all that Wittgenstein really means by elementary propositions are the fundamental basics of a proposition. So, if the proposition is something like Socrates is a wise Athenian, it would depend on the elementary propositions Socrates is wise and Socrates is an Athenian. Or at least this gives us an idea of what it would be like. What makes these elementary propositions so fundamental is the fact that they are independent of each other and that their truth or falsity doesn't depend on other factors. Perhaps, however, sensing how difficult, and maybe even impossible, it would be to find what exactly the most fundamental propositions that don't depend on any others for their truth or falsity are, Wittgenstein doesn't give us any examples like this. Again, as with the focus on objects and states of affairs, he aims to describe what the logical, necessary components of this system are, and is silent on whether he necessarily knows what those would be or not for a given example. So he will refer to them by simple names like P, Q, R, etc. So Socrates is a wise Athenian would depend on Socrates is wise and Socrates is an Athenian, i.e. P and Q. Socrates is wise, P. Socrates is an Athenian, Q. P and Q, Socrates is a wise Athenian. So, if we take all the elementary propositions that constitute a given proposition and list all the possible combinations of truth and falsity, and whether these would make the proposition itself true or false, we would understand the proposition in full. And this sense would be entirely internal to the proposition and self-contained. That is, it would show itself without needing to be said. And there is one tool that does this precisely: truth tables. Truth tables, like the logical calculus of Frege, also have a long history in logic, and anyone who has taken a logic class has likely been acquainted with them. It is generally believed that Wittgenstein is, to some degree, the inventor and popularizer of these truth tables. However, there's some debate over whether earlier figures really invented the form or not. Regardless, any given elementary proposition is either true or false. If we have two elementary propositions, P and Q, there are four truth possibilities. 1, both P and Q are true. 2, P is false and Q is true. 3, P is true and Q is false. And 4, both P and Q are false. These possibilities will grow exponentially as we add in more elementary propositions, but we will work with only two for the sake of simplicity. We can express the truth conditions of a proposition involving P and Q, such as if P then Q, in the following way. Here we have all the possibilities of P and Q, and under those possibilities, whether if P then Q will be true or false. If P is true and Q is true, then if P then Q will be true. If P is false and Q is true, then if P then Q could still be true, since something else could make Q true that isn't P. If P is true and Q is false, then if P then Q is false. And if P is false and Q is false, then if P then Q could still be true. Assuming a fixed order in our notation for these truth possibilities, we can express these propositions as this results column in a kind of string of truth and false symbols, i.e. TT, for P and Q. And every law of logic can be written in this manner. I won't go through them all in detail, but as you can see, TT of P and Q is a tautology, meaning if P then P and if Q then Q, meaning something that is always true. And then not both P and Q would be written as FTTT, if Q then P as TFTT, if P then Q as TTFT, and so on for P or Q, not P, P or Q but not both, if P then Q and if Q then P, Q, neither P nor Q, P and not Q, Q and not Q, and Q and P, and lastly for a contradiction, such as P and not P and Q and not Q. And as a tautology, only has TTTT, symbolizing that it is always true. A contradiction will have FFFF, symbolizing that it is always false. These parenthetical strings are called truth grounds by Wittgenstein in 5.101. And if we know a proposition's truth grounds, we know everything there is to know about it and know the sense of that proposition, according to Wittgenstein. The advantage of this notation is that it expresses the sense of a proposition with no connectives, such as and, or, and if then. None of these connectives are essential to the sense of a proposition, since that sense can be expressed in the truth tables without them. And this is right in line with Wittgenstein's proposal that logical constants do not represent anything, 4.0312, since they don't show anything more than a truth table does without them. Furthermore, he asserts that this system accounts for all the workings of logical inference. Frege and Russell thought that we needed laws of inference to follow in their axiomatic systems, but Wittgenstein shows that there is no need to appeal to some kind of law to infer things. A proposition follows from another if the first is true whenever the second is true. See the following. P and Q is written as TFFF of P and Q, and P or Q is written as TTTF of P and Q. As we can see, where there is a T in the first proposition, there is a T in the second one as well. Therefore, the second proposition follows from the first, and we don't need any laws to tell us this. It shows itself plainly when the notation is so direct. There are two limiting cases to this, however: tautologies and contradictions. A tautology is always true, such as P, and a contradiction is never true, such as P and not P. The word Wittgenstein uses to describe contradictions and tautologies is sinnlos, or senseless. However, note that this is not the same as unsinnig, or nonsensical. Nonsensical is the word he uses to describe propositions like the number 2 is purple. These he calls senseless, because they do not convey any particular sense of the world. However, they are held together in a logical manner, in that they consist of the truth possibilities of elementary propositions. So, for example, "It is raining and it is not raining" is a contradiction and thus never true, but there is nothing illogical about it since it can be expressed in a truth table and logical notation such as P and not P. The only propositions that should be excluded from logic are those that cannot be written in logical notation or established as true or false whatsoever, such as the number 2 is purple. Wittgenstein says that tautologies and contradictions belong in logic in the same way that the value 0 belongs in arithmetic. This is a stance against Frege and Russell, who held that contradictions are illogical and thus not a part of logic. Wittgenstein says that this is an arbitrary limitation. Something being logical does not mean it has to be actual as long as it can be expressed in a correct logical manner. So there is no reason to exclude propositions that are always false, such as contradictions. The last area to note here is the status of probability. The logic of inference is the basis for probability. Take as example these two propositions again. P and Q, T FFF of P and Q, or P or Q, T T T F of P and Q. If P and Q is true, the former, then there is a 1 out of 3 chance that the latter will also be true, based on nothing but the possibilities of their truth grounds. However, Wittgenstein wants to emphasize that this is only a theoretical procedure based on psychological grounds. In reality, there are no degrees of probability. Propositions are either true or false. 5.153. 5.2. The structures of propositions stand in internal relations to one another. 5.3. All propositions are results of truth operations on elementary propositions. A truth operation is the way in which a truth function is produced out of elementary propositions. It is of the essence of truth operations that just as elementary propositions yield a truth function of themselves, so too in the same way truth functions yield a further truth function. When a truth operation is applied to truth functions of elementary propositions, it always generates another truth function of elementary propositions, another proposition. When a truth operation is applied to the results of truth operations on elementary propositions, there is always a single operation on elementary propositions that has the same result. Every proposition is the result of truth operations on elementary propositions. 5.4. At this point, it becomes manifest that there are no logical objects or logical constants in Frege's and Russell's sense. 5.41. The reason is that the results of truth operations on truth functions are always identical whenever they are one and the same truth function of elementary propositions. 5.42. It is self-evident that or, if then, etc. are not relations in the sense in which right and left, etc. are relations. The interdefinability of Frege's and Russell's primitive signs of logic is enough to show that they are not primitive signs, still less signs for relations. And it is obvious that the if-then defined by means of not and or is identical with the one that figures with not in the definition of or, and that the second or is identical with the first one, and so on. 5.43. Even at first sight, it seems scarcely credible that there should follow from one fact P infinitely many others, namely not P, not P, etc. And it is no less remarkable that the infinite number of propositions of logic, mathematics, follow from half a dozen primitive propositions. But in fact, all the propositions of logic say the same thing, to wit nothing. 5.44. Truth functions are not material functions. For example, an affirmation can be produced by double negation. In such a case, does it follow that in some sense negation is contained in affirmation? Does not P negate not P, or does it affirm P, or both? The proposition not P is not about negation, as if negation were an object. On the other hand, the possibility of negation is already written into affirmation. And if there were an object called not, it would follow that not P said something different from what P said, just because the one proposition would then be about not and the other would not. 5.45. If there are primitive logical signs, then any logic that fails to show clearly how they are placed relatively to one another, and to justify their existence, will be incorrect. The construction of logic out of its primitive signs must be made clear. 5.46. If we introduce logical signs properly, then we should also have introduced at the same time the sense of all combinations of them, i.e. not only P or Q, but it is not the case that P or not Q as well, etc., etc. We should also have introduced at the same time the effect of all possible combinations of brackets, and thus it would have been made clear that the real general primitive signs are not P or Q, there is an X and f of X, etc., but the most general form of their combinations. In the previous section, Wittgenstein criticized the idea that we need laws of inference in our logic, because all propositions show their sense by nothing more than the truth grounds of their elementary propositions. Here he attacks something else even more fundamental to Frege's and Russell's work in logic, the idea of logical axioms and logical objects. Here again, background is necessary. Frege and Russell defined logic as a supremely general set of laws in the form of propositions. So just as the laws of chemistry pertain to all chemical interactions and the laws of physics pertain to all natural phenomena, the laws of logic pertain to everything, including other laws and to themselves. The laws of logic dictate the form that other sets of laws can take. For example, we might imagine that there would be physical laws other than the ones we have. For example, as Sparknote said, we could imagine that massive bodies would repel each other instead of attracting one another. But we cannot imagine physical laws that are illogical. If P then Q is true and P is true, then Q is true. And this will apply to any propositions no matter what they contain to. This is why logic is prior to psychology, to mathematics, to metaphysics, and anything else in philosophy or science. And by this notion, anything is rational if it follows the laws of logic. Logic is for Frege and Russell an axiomatic system. There are certain axioms, certain logical objects or connectives, and certain laws of inference. For example, the above if P then Q, and P then Q is a fundamental axiom, and it is made up of fundamental objects like if then and that are self-evidently true. And laws of inference tell us how to deduce all propositions from fundamental axioms. What these laws of inference mean is this. P or not P, for example, is an axiom. P has to be the case or not P has to be the case, and there is no other way, and this is an axiomatic truth. P or not P is not an axiom, but it follows from the axiom P or not P, so it is assured to be true as well. Wittgenstein's critique is that it is trying to give too much of a metaphysical background to logic, and not letting logic speak for itself, or take care of itself, in his words. It is trying to say what can only be shown. P or not P and P or not P have the exact same truth grounds when drawn up in a truth table, TT of P. And because a proposition's sense is nothing more than its truth grounds, these are just the same proposition in the first place, so there's no law of inference to use, since they don't say anything different at all. Russell tries to give a metaphysics and grounding of sorts for logic when the very definition of logic is something that has to come before all metaphysics and has to stand on its own, and, in Wittgenstein's words, take care of itself. In fact, it's not even correct to say that P or not P and P or not P have the same sense. These are both tautologies, so they don't express any sense at all. In fact, all propositions of logic are tautologies by definition. All axioms and propositions of logic are equivalent, and there are no preeminent ones because they are all tautologies. Or in his words, they all say nothing. Wittgenstein effectively dissociates the importance of notation from logic completely. All that is essential to a proposition is its sense. If P or not Q expresses the same sense as it is not the case that Q or not P, they are the same proposition because they have the same truth grounds. And so-called logical axioms are just tautologies. They say the same thing, nothing. There is no need to explain how one elementary proposition like P can imply infinite numbers of further ones like not P, not P, etc. They are all the same proposition. See 5.43. Because of this, there is no need to explain things like operations. We might think that there is some process where we combine elementary propositions like P and Q to make P and Q, and we'd need to find some way to explain how these can come together. An operation can be applied successively to produce a series of propositions. Sometimes it can cancel itself out, such as not, where P becomes not P, and then not P, etc., thereby becoming P again. Some operations can make an infinite series of different propositions, but all propositions are nothing more than a number of operations performed on elementary propositions. These operations combine or modify the truth functions of elementary propositions, so we call them truth operations. However, where Frege and Russell make a mistake is that they think that operations are some kind of object or form. Operations are not an action of some kind we take. Since propositions are ultimately nothing more than their truth grounds, operations are nothing more than a shorthand explanation of the difference between their truth grounds. For example, P and Q have different truth grounds, and the adding of Q is simply a way to express that. There's no real operation going on there. We're just explaining the difference of the truth grounds between P and Q. Any operation that expresses the same relation is the same operation in the same way that any notation that expresses the same sense is the same proposition. Which is why not P and not P are the same thing. And because of this, Wittgenstein concludes that there is something fundamentally flawed about ideas of logical objects or logical constants in the vein of Frege and Russell, 5.4. Frege built his entire system from the quote-unquote primitive connectives not and if-then, meaning that every other logical operation can be defined in terms of them. Russell did the same, building his from not and or. But these are in fact interchangeable. Frege's if P then Q is the same as Russell's Q or not P, and Russell's P or Q is the same as Frege's if not P then Q. And if the same proposition can be expressed in different ways, that means that there is nothing primitive or fundamental about it. All propositions of logic, axioms, etc., say the same thing, which is nothing. 5.47. It is clear that whatever we can say in advance about the form of all propositions, we must be able to say all at once. An elementary proposition really contains all logical operations in itself. For f of a says the same thing as there is an x and f of x and x equals a. Wherever there is compositeness, argument and function are present, and where these are present, we already have all the logical constants. One could say that the sole logical constant was what all propositions by their very nature had in common with one another, but that is the general propositional form. 5.5. Every truth function is a result of successive applications to elementary propositions of the operation t, xi, and so on. This operation negates all the propositions in the right-hand pair of brackets, and I call it the negation of those propositions. 5.51. If xi has only one value, then negation of bar xi equals not p. If it has two values, then negation of bar xi equals not p and not q. 5.52. If xi has as its values all the values of a function f of x for all values of x, then negation of bar xi equals It is not the case that there is an x in f of x. 5.53. Identity of object I express by identity of sign, and not by using a sign for identity. Difference of objects I express by difference of signs. 5.54. In the general propositional form, propositions occur in other propositions only as bases of truth operations. Logic, in Wittgenstein's words in 5.473, must take care of itself. We don't need any rules or laws to tell us how logic should function. Whatever is ruled out by logic will be impossible or inconceivable, and we don't need laws or rules to tell us what that is. If something lacks sense, it is only because we haven't given a meaning to the signs in the proposition. For instance, the proposition Socrates is identical says nothing, because we have not given a meaning to the word identical when used as an adjective. 5.4733. Because all logical propositions are equivalent, the laws of logic that govern propositions must all be given in advance and all at once, rather than in a hierarchical axiomatic system like Frege and Russell. For example, P and Q means the same thing as it is not the case that not P or Q, and f of a means the same thing as there exists an x such that f of x and x is a. 5.47. All the logical constants must be given at once if they are given at all, and if so, this is because they all share the same general propositional form. Wittgenstein calls this the essence of a proposition. 5.471. It should serve as the sole logical constant and render all other constants superfluous. What he has in mind by the sole logical constant is an application of a negating operation. What he is alluding to here is the Sheppard Stroke, a logical constant discovered in the early 20th century. Frege developed a logical system defining everything in terms of not and if-then, and Russell developed one relying only on not or. But the Sheppard Stroke, symbolized as a vertical bar, can stand on its own. The Sheppard Stroke is a negation of disjunction, or not both. It means that the one or the other can be the case, but not both, often called NAND for short, not and. P NAND Q is the same as saying not P or Q, or not P or not Q. It is functionally complete, meaning that it alone can represent all logical operations because it can represent negation, not P, conjunction, P and Q, disjunction, P or Q, and implication, if P then Q. This might seem incredible at first, but keep in mind just how much computers can express with coding that is ultimately nothing more than zeros and ones. And I will prove the Sheppard Stroke's complete functionality here. Okay, so let's look at a truth table for P NAND Q. If P is true and Q is true, then P NAND Q is false, because at least one of them has to be false for P NAND Q to be true. If P is false and Q is true, then P NAND Q can be true. If P is true and Q is false, then P NAND Q can be true. And if P is false and Q is false, then P NAND Q can still be true. I.e., the truth grounds written in a parenthetical string in Wittgenstein style would be F, T, 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 P, and Q. Compare this, however, with the truth functions of P and Q, which read T, F, 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 P, and Q. We can see that the values are opposite, meaning that the Sheppard Stroke has the same value as negation. See, for example, the truth table for P NAND P. If P is true, then P NAND P is false. If P is false, then P NAND P is true, i.e. Ft of P, which is exactly the truth function of not P. Therefore, we can say that for any well-formed formula, the negation of that formula is the same as the Sheppard Stroke applied to it. Therefore, the Sheppard Stroke takes care of negation. What about conjunction? Let's say we have P and Q. Now, since the Sheppard stroke is the equivalent of negation of P and Q, we can say that the Sheppard P NAND Q equals negation of P and Q, and that P and Q equals the negation of P and Q, and therefore that P and Q equals the negation of P NAND Q, and that P and Q equals P NAND Q NAND P NAND Q. For disjunction, we have P or Q, which is the same as not P or not Q. Therefore, we can say that P or Q is the same as the negation of not P and not Q. And therefore, we can say that it is the negation of P NAND P and Q NAND Q. And since this is a negation of disjunction, we can say that P NAND P NAND Q NAND Q. And lastly, for implication, we have if P then Q, which is the same as P NAND not Q, meaning that either P has to be true or not Q has to be true. And therefore, we can write this as P NAND Q NAND Q. Therefore, Wittgenstein thinks that all non-Sheppard stroke signs in logic are ultimately redundant, and this is why this joint negation can function as the sole logical constant. He will use this in logical formulas. With that in mind, all propositions can be derived by means of successive applications of the operation T, Xi, and so on. That is, by means of negating all the terms in the right-hand pair of brackets. For instance, P would become not P, P and Q would become not P and not Q, and so on. Wittgenstein abbreviates this terminology to negation of bar Xi, where N stands for negation and the bar Xi stands collectively for all the propositions in the right-hand pair of brackets, 5.502. Xi is simply a placeholder value, and the bar on top of it means that this applies for all values that could take its place. And because all logic is so simple in general, Wittgenstein has ruled out laws of inference, logical axioms, and logical objects. He says that we need no axioms or rules to tell us what can be logical and what can't. Logic is even more simple, general, and universal than Frege and Russell thought. We cannot dictate to logic what it can and cannot express. Everything at all that can be said and judged as true or false is logical, and whatever is not logical cannot be said. This includes contradictions as part of logic because they have a truth grounds, i.e., always false. The last part of this is one of the most complicated and controversial parts of the Tractatus' logic. In the traditional system of logic, there is a difference between truth-functional logic and quantifier logic, i.e., truth-functional logic talks about single propositions joined to form more complex propositions, whereas quantifier logic talks about generalizations made about entire classes of propositions, i.e., for all x, there is an x such that, etc. Whereas truth-functional would only be x, not x, or things like that. Wittgenstein's system of truth tables would seem to be highly effective at communicating individual propositions. But Frege's and Russell's logic contains quantification expressed with the universal quantifier for each, and the existential quantifier there exists some. Therefore, it seems like we can say that one proposition is true or false, but not that a proposition is true or false for all values of x, or that there exists an x such that the proposition is true or false. But Wittgenstein shows that it can. Take, for example, negation of f of x. This is the negation of the function f of x, which is equivalent to saying that f of x is false for all values of x. Then we have the negation of f of x. Negating it again says that there is at least one value of x that makes f of x true, which is the equivalent to the existential generation. we can say f of negation of x. This says that there is a value of x that makes f of x false. And lastly, negation of f of negation of x. And by negating the above, we have the universal generalization, that f of x is true for all values of x. Furthermore, Wittgenstein wants to get rid of the sign of identity along with the sign for generality. He says that identity is another superfluous sign in logic, since this equivalence should be apparent from the form alone. In his words, to say of two things that they are identical is nonsense, because they would not really be two things in the first place. They would only be the same thing with two different names, and in a perfect logic, we should never give the same thing two different names. And to say of one thing that it is identical with itself is to say nothing. This account is, however, a little problematic in context of the Tractatus, as it seems to be a contradiction. Using f of x as an expression for any value of x seems to imply that f of x is intended as a kind of logical sum, as in f of a or f of b or f of c, etc. But at 5.521, Wittgenstein explicitly criticizes Frege and Russell for introducing generality in terms of logical sums and products. We can resolve this contradiction, though, by reading Wittgenstein as criticizing Frege and Russell for defining generality in terms of logical sums and products, rather than seeing that logical sums and products exist inherently in the form of generality. I.e., I think what this is trying to say is that he's saying that they are trying to say that which is only shown. In fact, Wittgenstein's logical atomism demands that he see generality in terms of logical sums and products, since he sees all propositions as being built up of combinations of elementary propositions. 5.541. At first sight, it looks as if it were also possible for one proposition to occur in another in a different way, particularly with certain forms of proposition in psychology, such as A believes that P is the case, and A has the thought P, etc. For if these are considered superficially, it looks as if the proposition P stood in some kind of relation to an object A. And in modern theory of knowledge, Russell, Moore, etc., these propositions have actually been construed in this way. 5.542. It is clear, however, that A believes that P, A has the thought P, and A says P are of the form P says P. And this does not involve a correlation of a fact with an object, but rather the correlation of facts by means of the correlation of their objects. 5.55. We now have to answer a priori the question about all the possible forms of elementary propositions. Elementary propositions consist of names. Since, however, we are unable to give the number of names with different meanings, we are also unable to give the composition of elementary propositions. 5.6. The limits of my language mean the limits of my world. This section of the Tractatus is the one that made me interested in reading it in the first place, as it was referenced in Subarashiki Hibi Furin Zokusonzai in a quite inventive and brilliant manner. But it is also one of the most difficult parts to grasp. The influence of Schopenhauer is apparently quite strong, but I personally don't know Schopenhauer nearly as well as I do Wittgenstein. What I do see echoes of are David Hume and many classical Buddhist thinkers, but Wittgenstein likely only had the opportunity to read the former of these, and even then does not seem to have engaged with him directly at any point. However, the area that I am talking about is about the soul, the self, and the human subject, which at first glance seems like a completely random deviation from the logical discussions above, so I need to explain how this connects. Wittgenstein has so far made a rather clean and austere system of logic. However, there is one kind of proposition that seems to present a challenge. Propositions of the form A says that P, or A believes that P, seem to involve P as one of its elementary propositions. But according to Wittgenstein, propositions only occur in another as bases of their truth functions. That is to say that they occur as parts of the truths and falsities in their truth tables. Because of this, the truth or falsehood of any elementary proposition that occurs in a proposition must contribute to the truth or falsity of the whole. But what about A says that P, or A believes that P? It would appear that the proposition P is being used in a larger proposition without having any bearing on the larger proposition's truth or falsity. After all, we can say or believe something without it being true, right? If John hopes that it will rain tomorrow, John hopes that P is a composite of, among other things, the proposition P, then P would have to have some bearing on the truth or falsity of the whole, but it appears that it does not in this case. The answer to this is that a proposition of the form A believes that P does not actually involve a relationship between A and the proposition P. In Wittgenstein's words, quote, "It is clear that A believes that P, A thinks P, A says P are of the form P says P, and here we have no coordination of a fact and an object, but a coordination of facts by means of a coordination of their objects," unquote, 5.542. For A to think, believe, or say that P is the case, the words that constitute the utterance of P must occur to A. It is then not A, but these words that are related to P, and the internal similarity between the words and the proposition is clear. So, in other words, it's saying that that proposition P somehow occurs in the consciousness, in the spoken word, in the hope, etc., etc., and the correlation is between that proposition as it manifests versus what it pictures, not some unified consciousness, A. So there's no need to have A in this proposition, since it's not a relation between A and P, it's a relation between P as it being true or false, and as it being manifest in A's consciousness. So with no A left to exist in that proposition, what is A referring to? Certainly not the soul, as Wittgenstein now says that there is no such thing as a soul or self in which thoughts and beliefs reside. 5.5421. He compares the soul to a two-dimensional image of points that make a cube and can appear to project in either direction, and says that the soul is a composite and that it only appears to have a certain form in this manner. Rather, the soul is a composite made up of numerous thoughts, beliefs, and attitudes that it entertains. In the same way that this cube doesn't really exist as a cube but only has the appearance of one, so these composites of all the beliefs, attitudes, etc. that the soul entertains appear as a soul to us from the outside. Because the soul is a composite, and in Wittgenstein's words, a composite soul would be a soul no longer, the soul cannot stand for a unified A in a proposition. When we talk of belief, we shouldn't analyze the proposition as existing between the belief and a unified consciousness. Rather, we should analyze it as existing between the belief as it is expressed and as it appears in the composite consciousness. We don't have to assume a person as a metaphysical subject in order to explain the relation between the proposition as expressed and the fact that it pictures. And because of this, we cannot learn a priori what kinds of objects or elementary propositions there are. Logic is prior to any particular experience, but not prior to the fact of experience itself. As SparkNotes says, it is the shape that experience takes. Logic can teach us that there are objects and elementary propositions, but it is a matter of applying logic that we come to learn about the varieties of objects and elementary propositions that there are. There is no such thing as logical experience that we can consult regarding the various forms of elementary propositions. 5.552. So this is why experience has no place in logical analysis, and Wittgenstein says that if we have to look at the world in order to apply logic, that shows that we have made a fundamental mistake. Therefore, Wittgenstein comes at last to say that the limits of my language mean the limits of my world in 5.6. He says that the limits of language are determined by the totality of elementary propositions, and the limits of the world are determined by the totality of facts, and there is a one-to-one correspondence between facts and elementary propositions. So we cannot say what lies outside the limits of the world, 5.61, just as we cannot say anything that lies outside the limits of logic. Essentially, everything that is in the world is logical and therefore capable of being expressed in language. And just as we cannot think anything illogical, we cannot speak of anything outside the world. We cannot, so to say, put ourselves in a place outside the world to look at it from the exterior. And if we view everything from the inside, so to speak, and cannot take a step outside of it, what is the self? What is the soul? What is the person, the human being? Wittgenstein here wants us to think about solipsism, the idea that I am the only thing that exists, that the whole world is my own mind or consciousness, or anything of this nature. This idea comes to all of us at some point in our lives, I think, but interestingly, none of us really seem to stick with it for long. Wittgenstein does believe that there is truth in solipsism, but that this truth is limited. We come to believe that solipsism is true because we only know of the existence of objects and other people because we are conscious of them. And Wittgenstein says that what the solipsist means is very correct, but because the solipsist tries to put into language what can only be shown, he misfires and begins speaking nonsense. Wittgenstein realizes that the limits of my language mean the limits of my world, and thus that I am the limit of my own world. But the problem with this is the conclusion that I am the only thing that exists, because if that is the case, what is this I? What is this thing that is the only thing that exists that I am even referring to? Here, Wittgenstein deals with a truth that Hume was, as far as we know, the first Western philosopher to formulate, but goes all the way back to the Buddha in Asia. I cannot find myself anywhere in my own experience. I can only be conscious of some thing, some object, not exist as a pure consciousness. And since I cannot find my own consciousness anywhere in my conscious experience, I'm suddenly at a loss to explain what this I is that is the only thing that exists. And in the language of the Tractatus, this can be expressed as there being no object or elementary proposition that corresponds to this I. There are thus no propositions with sense, true or false, relating to it. Wittgenstein says that we might think of the relationship between the metaphysical subject and the world as that of like the eye and the visual field. 5.633. I cannot see my eye anywhere in the visual field, but the existence of a visual field presupposes the existence of an eye to see it. Myself, too, is not something I encounter anywhere in my own experience. The idea of a self is thus not something that appears in the world and is not something that can be talked about. It is rather a limit to the world, and as discussed above is nothing more than the thoughts, ideas, and beliefs that constitute it. There is nothing distinct from and more essential to the self than this. We could say that the self is nothing more than the limit of the number of lit light bulbs that manage to make the world. But that doesn't mean that there's some self in a higher dimension that we can access. That just means that it's an insubstantial limit. Of course, at this point, there is no actual distinction between solipsism and pure realism, the idea that there are in fact objects and people in the world in just the way we think there is normally. The solipsist's idea of the self is not something that can be expressed in language, and therefore it does not rule out any factual statements that can be made about the world, and any with actual sense. And since these are the only real way to make sense of the world, the realist and the solipsist are in fact only creating a distinction in the form of pseudo-propositions that don't mean anything. The self is the same thing as the world, logic, and language. It is the limit to all that there is. And the solipsist wants to express this truth, but cannot make any meaningful statement to that effect because, as we have established above, We cannot make general statements about the nature of the world, logic or language of a metaphysical nature, since these are not things that can be pictured and have a logical form. And now we are back where we were, that only propositions expressing truth functions of elementary propositions have a sense. Proposition 6. The general form of a truth function is bar p, bar xi, negation of bar xi. This is the general form of a proposition. 6.1. The propositions of logic are tautologies. 6.2. Mathematics is a logical method. The propositions of mathematics are equations and therefore pseudo-propositions. Now, Wittgenstein wants to explain exactly what the form of a proposition is, which is an expression of truth function. Remember how all logical operations are in truth nothing more than repeated applications of the Sheppard Stroke, which is a form of negation? Therefore, all logical propositions are simply one of a series of negations on certain elementary propositions. Or in Wittgenstein's notation, bar p, bar xi, negation of bar xi. This is a form for expressing a series. A series is a mathematical entity that consists of a number of terms arranged in a particular order. For example, the series of square numbers is 1, 4, 9, 16, etc. In 5.2522, Wittgenstein gives a general form for expressing a term in a particular series as a, x, o to x, where a stands for the first term in the series, x for an arbitrarily selected term, and o to x for the term that immediately follows x. The O is an operation by which a term in the series is generated out of another. For instance, the series of square numbers could be expressed as 1x square of x plus 1 to the power of 2. And the successive application of an operation is the model of a proposition. He defines the general propositional form as bar p, bar xi, negation of bar xi, which is a variation on the ax o to x form. Wittgenstein puts a bar over something to symbolize that it applies for all the values that it represents. So, bar p refers to all the elementary propositions of a proposition. Bar xi is a complex proposition in the series of successive negations, and negation of bar xi shows how the next term in the series will be formed, by negating all the terms in bar xi. Frege had earlier tried to find something more certain than pure intuition to ground the concepts of number and mathematical progression. In fact, this was one of his primary motivations in his developments of logic. In this, he argued against Kant, who argued that our knowledge of mathematics is based on pure intuition, since any number can be generated by adding a certain number of ones, such as 4 equals 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1, 98 equals 1 plus 1 plus 1, etc. Pure intuition is necessary for the concept of and so on that makes it possible to add infinitely many ones together. Frege claimed he could make pure intuition unnecessary to mathematics by giving a definition of number based in logic that would provide a general rule more rigorous than and so on for adding successive ones. Wittgenstein says that mathematics is a method of logic, 6.234, but that numbers are not logical objects constructed out of logical forms. Instead, quote, a number is the exponent of an operation, unquote, 6.021. So numbers are a shorthand for expressing how many times an operation has been applied. However, his philosophy here largely relies on the concept of and so on that was so anathema to Frege. In his later philosophy, the difficulties of the concept of and so on would be very important to Wittgenstein, but here he seems curiously unconcerned with it. Lastly, Wittgenstein argues against Russell and Frege in claiming that the propositions of logic are tautologies that lack sense and say nothing. He uses a telling metaphor to illustrate his conception of logic. Quote, the logical propositions describe the scaffolding of the world, or rather they present it. Unquote, 6.124. And if we consider this metaphor, it reveals quite a lot about what logic is truly like to Wittgenstein. 1. Scaffolding is a framework structure. It is a skeleton of joints, not a building with walls and rooms. Similarly, logic does not consist of propositions with a sense, but only provides a framework within which propositions with a sense may fit. 2. The framework of scaffolding is used to construct a more substantial building, just as logic provides a framework within which the substantial facts about the world may fit. 3. Scaffolding has points of contact with the building it is placed against, but it does not overlap with the building, nor is it a part of the building. Logic has points of contact with the world in that both logic and the world share a logical form, but the content, as opposed to the form of facts, has no analog in logic. And 4. Scaffolding is only a tool, used in construction. A sturdy and complete building has no need of scaffolding. Similarly, as Wittgenstein claimed in 5.5563, quote, all propositions of our colloquial language are actually just as they are logically completely in order, unquote. We do not need logic or philosophy when language is functioning normally. They are only tools needed to clarify language when it misfires and attempts to speak nonsense. And as he says, the propositions of logic are all tautologies that say nothing, 6.1 to 6.11. Any attempt to give content to them is misguided. That they are true shows itself in their structure, and this structure helps us to understand the formal properties of language in the world, 6.12. We cannot express anything by means of logical propositions because they are tautologies with no sense. And since they are all the same in that they say nothing, there is no real need to prove logical propositions. What we call proof with regard to them is the same as proofs in mathematics, something that is only necessary in complicated situations where the propositions, being tautologies, is not immediately evident, 6.1262. But that is not the same as a kind of proof that establishes the truth of propositions with sense. To prove the truth of a proposition with sense, we must show that it follows from something else that we already know to be true. But propositions of logic all follow from themselves and thus do not need to be deduced from other propositions. Rather, we could say that the propositions of logic give us the form of logical proof, 6.1264. For example, the tautology if P then Q, and P then Q, shows us that given the non-tautologous propositions if P then Q, and P, we can prove another non-tautologous proposition, Q. Quote, mathematics is a method of logic, unquote, 6.2. Similarly, numbers are all derived from the successive application of operations, which is a logical method. The propositions of mathematics are all equations, where we say that one expression is equivalent of another, such as 7 plus 5 equals 12. And since, as discussed above, the sign for identity is superfluous, these are all pseudo-propositions. They only express equivalence of form and do not tell us anything. For example, the plus 5 only points out the difference in truth grounds for 7 and 12. The operations are not in truth real substantial things. They are only expressions of a different of truth grounds. They only express equivalence of form and not anything substantial. They do not express thoughts. They are rather abstractions that help us infer propositions about the world. 6.211. This section on mathematics is a little flimsy and was one of the first areas that was heavily critiqued by Russell and especially by Frank Ramsey, who was the first to point out that, what are you talking about? The propositions of mathematics are not all equations. There are not equal signs in mathematics as well. So this section needs a little more rounding out, but regardless, it wouldn't be too hard to make mathematics fit into Wittgenstein's logical picture. 6.3. The exploration of logic means the exploration of everything that is subject to law, and outside logic all is accident. For Wittgenstein, mathematics and logical propositions do not express any thoughts or sense. Metaphysical claims about abstract entities do not express sense and are strictly speaking nonsense. The only thing that he seems to have left us able to say are individual facts about what holds or not in the world. They have to be able to represent a state of affairs that we can picture through logical form for us to know their sense. But this leaves one unresolved area of language and thought. Wittgenstein earlier established that the only things we can meaningfully say are propositions of natural science that say how things hold or not in the world. But what about laws of science? Like the law of causality that states that all processes occur through causes and effects. The law of conservation that states that matter or energy can never be created or destroyed. Or the law of least expenditure that states that the true trajectory of a particle, ray, wave, etc. to a certain destination is that which takes the least action. These are not logical facts, since they make specific claims about things will happen in the world. They could be other than they are. Wittgenstein earlier claimed that even the general claim of induction, that the future will resemble the past, depends on a connection between the past and future that is not logical. 5.1361. In his own words, superstition is belief in the causal nexus, and there is no logical reason to infer anything about the future from the past. All other natural laws are similarly not logical because they are not true a priori and make claims about experience. However, they also aren't simple facts about how things stand in the world, as Wittgenstein earlier said are the only meaningful propositions, and therefore would not be likely to fit into the ontology of facts at the beginning of the Tractatus. It's one thing to say I kicked the ball and the ball moved, which could be particular enough to be divided into I kicked the ball and the ball moved, which could be two atomic facts. But it's quite another to say my kicking of the ball caused it to move. This proposition does something much more complicated. Such scientific laws seem to work as explanations, providing general rules for how and why things happen the way they do. Wittgenstein himself provides an uncommonly clear and helpful metaphor for understanding this. Laws of nature are like a mesh grid that we lay over a surface of black and white spots. The grid is divided into small squares, and we can describe the surface by saying whether each square is black or white. Of course, we could have also used a triangular or hexagonal mesh, or one with mixed shapes, but one kind of surface will likely provide a more accurate and simpler description of the surface than another. The mesh itself tells us nothing about the description of black and white on the surface, but we can learn about the surface by observing what kinds of mesh describe it most accurately. The laws of nature are like this mesh. They do not tell us anything about the world, and are not even necessarily true of the world. They are only tools that we use to make sense of the world. So what does this view of science look like in action? Take the law of causality. We say that this law says that everything has a cause, but this is not a truth that we discover in nature. It is a principle that we apply to nature. To use the example from SparkNotes, let's say a person puts coins into a candy machine. The first 10 times he puts a coin in and a piece of candy comes out at the bottom. The 11th time he puts a coin in exactly the same as before, but no candy comes out. His immediate conclusion is that something in the machine must have operated differently on this 11th time, even if it seems to him as if everything had happened the same as the previous 10 times. So we can only understand this by thinking that there must be a cause of that difference. Wittgenstein says, quote, "If there were a law of causality, it might be put in the following way. There are laws of nature. But of course that cannot be said. It makes itself manifest." Unquote, 6.36. He is saying that the law of causality amounts to nothing more than a belief that things happen for a reason, that it is not just pure chance that no candy came out on the 11th try. The laws of nature exist just to tell us that. There are regularities in nature, and nothing happens without a reason. He says that causality is not even a law, but in his words, quote, "the form of a law," unquote, 6.32. i.e., we have to accept causality if we are even to use laws to explain natural phenomena in the first place. In Wittgenstein's words, We cannot compare any process with the passage of time, since there is no such thing, but only with another process, like the movement of a chronometer. And this is the same for space. We describe two events that exclude one another as not happening because there is nothing to cause one rather than the other, but it is really only that we cannot describe one of the events without some kind of asymmetry. To illustrate what he means, Wittgenstein offers an interesting response to a problem first formulated by Kant about right and left-hand gloves. But in order to really understand what he's arguing, we need to reconstruct what Kant's problem really is. Before Kant, Leibniz argued that space is nothing more than relation between objects. So all space can be thought of in terms of ideas like distance, positioning above or below, etc. This is not quite the same as Einstein's theory of the relativity of space and time, but early on, Leibniz is saying that space is relative in this way. It deals relatively with the relation between objects. So, for example, if every single point of space in the universe shifted 4 meters to the right, Leibniz would say that no change really occurred, because everything would have the same distance from each other, and be in the same place relative to everything else. But Kant gives an argument against this. Kant asks us to imagine a universe with nothing in it but a left-hand glove and a right-hand glove. The two gloves are absolutely identical in all features that Leibniz could describe for relational space. They have the same distance between their fingers, the same width and height, they have the same volume, etc., etc. However, the left-hand glove remains distinct from the right-hand glove, so it must be through some other way than relations, because no matter how identical they are in all those relative features, we cannot turn the one glove around and cover the other in the three-dimensional space. Wittgenstein first addresses this by showing that Kant is actually making the problem much more complex than it needs to be, because this problem exists not only with three-dimensional figures, but with two-dimensional plane ones, and even with one-dimensional figures on a one-dimensional line. To illustrate this, he shows two forms in a one-dimensional space, i.e. a single line, which are exactly the same in all their relational features, but which can never be made to overlap without being rotated in the second dimension. And he says that just in the same way, the gloves could overlap if one were to rotate one of them in four-dimensional space. And what that really shows is that the gloves, the line forms, etc. are all congruent. The fact that we can't cover one with the other is irrelevant to them being identical. It's only a projection based on how we think of identity or congruence for our own convenience. There is no reason to think that the two-dimensional view where the two figures can be made to overlap is more natural or right than the one-dimensional one where they cannot, other than our own convenience of wanting to overlap them. Quote, one might say, using Hertz's terminology, that only connections that are subject to law are thinkable, unquote, 6.361. That is, we can only make sense of natural phenomena if we see them as conforming to some kind of regularity. To understand nature, we have to construct some system of mechanics or laws. We do not actually see causes and effects at work in nature, but we can only make sense of natural phenomena if we read cause and effect into them. But this causality is not something that is logical, nor something discovered in experience. This would be reifying causality, that is, thinking of it as a thing that has some sort of being. Causality has no being, either as a part of logical form or as a binding force at work upon nature. It is only a tool that we use in trying to understand the regularities of nature. By reifying laws of nature and thinking of them as things with substantial natures, we start to think that modern science can fully explain the world. We think that we have identified the fundamental truths about the workings of the world. But this is wrong. All we have really done is found a framework within which we can think about the workings of the world. This framework is in many ways more powerful than superstition, but they work according to the same principle in the end. Both scientific laws and superstition observe things that happen in the world and provide explanations for why things happen the way they do. But the explanations are never something that we find in nature. They are only a part of the framework we adopt to look at the things that happen. And this is why Wittgenstein says that the modern world stops short at laws of nature, much in the same way that the ancients stopped at God or fate. And like the ancients have God and fate, so we have the laws of nature at a stopping point where we acknowledge that our explanations can go no farther. However, Wittgenstein actually claims that the ancients were far clearer, in that they at least acknowledged the terminus of their system, while modern science is deluded into thinking that everything is explained. Now, it should be noted that Wittgenstein is not anti-scientific, even if he has come across that way to many. He does not think that scientific truths are useless, and more importantly, he does not think that they are simply matters of convention. All he wants to suggest is that the laws we use to explain natural phenomena are not themselves things that have been discovered experimentally. He is skeptical of the power of science to give us answers to the fundamental philosophical questions that it claims to have settled. Furthermore, the world has no logical connection to my will. 6.373. Neither my will nor natural phenomena have any effect on what is possible or impossible and what is necessary, because everything that is impossible or necessary is a priori so. Therefore, just as there is only logical necessity, so there is only logical impossibility. 6.4. All propositions are of equal value. 6.5. When the answer cannot be put into words, neither can the question be put into words. The riddle does not exist. If a question can be framed at all, it is also possible to answer it. Proposition 7. What we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence. This final section of the Tractatus is undoubtedly the most controversial, difficult to understand, and yet also seemingly important part of the Tractatus. Most interpretations of the work's ultimate meaning somehow rest on the propositions in this section. But what exactly do they talk about? It is hard to summarize them, and I would almost just want to read them, or suggest you read them yourself in light of what you've heard in this video. There seems to be a lot crammed into these sections, as he quickly addresses ethics, aesthetics, death, the mystical, and lastly, the nature of both philosophy and the Tractatus itself. I will try to summarize this section to the best of my ability, but please keep in mind that much of this is my own interpretation and that different readers will likely take something different away from it. "6.4 claims that, quote, all propositions are of equal value, unquote. And this sets the tone for pretty much the whole of 6.4. Statements of value, such as those of ethics or aesthetics, only make sense if they try to set themselves outside the world and all being so. But just as we discussed with the impossibility of metaphysics or statements about the self or the soul, we cannot set ourselves outside the world. He doesn't think that we can express something higher, since no proposition with meaning can get outside of logic or the world to some higher place. He claims that good or bad willing cannot change the world, since it cannot change what we are capable of saying in language, or what is the case or not. He rather claims that good or bad willing can only alter the limits of the world. The world must wax or wane as a whole, in his words. In this way, the world, the self, and life are all deeply tied to ethics in that they set the limit of what is the world by setting its boundaries. In death, too, we have not an event in life, but the end of life in the world, and thus not something that we experience. He says that not only is there no guarantee of the eternal survival of the soul after death, but that this assumption in the first place will not solve any problems or riddles. In his words, is not this eternal life as enigmatic as our present one? Thus, all of the meanings of the world and life, all of the answers to the questions of life cannot truly be established, as we can't get higher enough to view them from the outside. But the mystical, perhaps what Wittgenstein sees as the human drive for creating meanings in religion or philosophy, are born from viewing the world sub specie aeternae, or under the sign of infinity, a phrase borrowed from Spinoza. It is seeing the world as a limited whole, understanding that there is something more to what we see as the world, but that it isn't something we can put into language, since there just isn't some higher perspective to create meaning from. This sounds rather captivating and fascinating as an idea, but the real upshot of it becomes even more radical in 6.5. He says that the answer to the nature of the world, the meaning of life, etc., are all ineffable. And if the answer is unsayable, the questions themselves have to be unsayable as well. And this means that the problems of life, the questions of philosophy, etc., are not things that have sense, and thus things that cannot be truly answered. And, as he says, the solution of the problems of life is nothing more than the vanishing of these questions. All we are left with are the propositions of natural science, which leaves the problems of life completely untouched, but also completely unnecessary. And what does this mean for him? That the quote-unquote correct method of philosophy would be to only say what can be said, the propositions of natural science, and to point out to others that they have made errors by giving signs the wrong meanings in their propositions when they try to create philosophical claims or questions. However, this is not at all what the Tractatus has been doing, is it? This is what Wittgenstein very much seems to be making massive statements about the nature of the world from the outside. Just look at propositions like the world is all that is the case. The world does not consist of facts but things, but facts, etc., etc. This is why Wittgenstein ends up saying that anyone who understands him will finally recognize his propositions as nonsensical and cast them aside, as we would a ladder after we have climbed up on it. And after we do this, after we cast away the ladder, all that remains is Proposition 7. What we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence. How on earth are we supposed to interpret this? What can Wittgenstein possibly mean when he says that if we are to truly understand him, we have to understand that all his propositions are nonsensical? From the very beginning, Bertrand Russell felt this tension palpably, and in his own words said, quote, "After all, Mr. Wittgenstein manages to say a good deal about what cannot be said, thus suggesting to the skeptical reader that possibly there may be some loophole," unquote, 21. Wittgenstein, however, insisted until the end that Russell had fundamentally missed the point of the Tractatus, which cast doubt on some idea of a loophole. If we remember, in 4.12, Wittgenstein said that formal concepts like numbers, objects, colors, etc. are things that are not defined but only shown, and thus things that cannot be meaningfully spoken of in propositions. And this presents a problem for the Tractatus. Just look at these first couple of propositions. 1. The world is all that is the case. 1.1. The world is the totality of facts, not of things. 1.11. The world is determined by the facts, and by there being all the facts. 1.12. For the totality of facts determines what is the case and also whatever is not the case. 1.13. The facts in logical space are the world. All this talk of the totality of facts, logical space, the world, certainly would count as metaphysical propositions about formal concepts that are not directly related to natural science. So what role can they play if they are nonsense? The traditional interpretation, as represented by PMS Hacker, takes Wittgenstein to be pointing out that the kinds of subject matter he treats of lies outside the realm of sensible discourse. These propositions try to talk about the world as a whole when we can only sensibly talk about itemized facts within the world. But if we remember this section, Wittgenstein does not get rid of the concepts of objects, number, color, etc. He simply says that they are shown but not said. And that is what the propositions of the Tractatus do. They show something that cannot be said. And once we understand this distinction, we can stop being tempted to make metaphysical assertions of our own and approach philosophy with the understanding that there are certain unutterable and fundamental truths about the world that can only make themselves manifest without being spoken. Whether these truths are expressly conveyed by the Tractatus and how similar they are to the seemingly metaphysical claims he makes above is a matter of dispute, i.e., if his objects are real objects in the world, or if they're objects of our experience, or what exactly they are, or even if the idea of objects is really what those fundamental truths are. But either way, this is the fundamental traditional understanding. However, since the early 1990s, a rival interpretation has gained traction that is commonly referred to as either the New Wittgenstein or the Resolute reading of the Tractatus. This view is first expressed by Cora Diamond and is also taken by James Conant and other notable names in the world of Wittgenstein scholarship. This view is called resolute because it believes that Wittgenstein's assertions at the end of the Tractatus should be interpreted with firm resolution. And what does this mean? This means that when he says that his propositions are nonsense, he means it, utterly and fully. They are as nonsensical and incapable of conveying meaning or truth as the pseudo-proposition, the number 2 is purple. And this might sound surprising. How can they be so nonsensical since we surely can get some meaning from them? The answer is that none of them can be used to construct a proposition with a sense of the form Wittgenstein says that P, where P is one of the propositions in the Tractatus. None of them can be put in correct logical form because they all refer to these formal concepts, etc., and thus none of them can be part of rational discourse. Now, we might be able to think we can understand them, though. Note that in 6.54, Wittgenstein does not say, "My propositions serve as elucidations in this way. Anyone who understands them eventually recognizes them as nonsensical." He says, "Anyone who understands me eventually recognizes them as nonsensical." There is nothing in the propositions to understand because they are nonsense, but we can understand the kind of frame of mind we would have to be in to think that these propositions make sense. Therefore, Wittgenstein is asking his readers to appreciate the frame of mind that produces metaphysical claims so that they can understand why such claims are nonsense. The whole Tractatus up to the ending in this way is a semi-ironic prologue of sorts that is intentionally made to fail. And it teaches us just how, when all philosophical questions are resolved, there are no answers left to give, and all our problems were pointed out as nonsense in the first place. Therefore, the traditional reading takes Wittgenstein to believe that objects, states of affairs, and all the rest exist, but can only be shown and not said. But the resolute reading takes Wittgenstein to be denying that it even makes sense to think of there being objects, states of affairs, and so on. With this in mind, Diamond and other resolute thinkers think that the early and late Wittgenstein are really not that different, in that both believe that making metaphysical claims at all is misguided, if not completely impossible. Many resolute readers of the Tractatus make the argument that the traditional reading takes too much influence from Russell's introduction, which was condemned by Wittgenstein in the first place, and that they took too little in Wittgenstein's own thoughts on the meaning of the work. And it is easy to see why, as Wittgenstein was very quiet on the meaning of his work, believing that he couldn't express his thoughts on it more clearly than he already had in the Tractatus proper. And in many ways, what he says about the Tractatus only makes it harder to interpret. Regardless, many of these writings give some credence to the resolute reading. First, let's look at the preface that Wittgenstein himself wrote for the Tractatus as an alternative to Russell's. It is considerably shorter and seems to not give much insight into what everyone wanted, an explanation of the book's contents. However, he does say something revealing, namely, that the whole meaning of the work was roughly as follows, quote, "What can be said at all must be said clearly, and whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent," unquote. He continues that the book will, therefore, quote, draw a limit to the expression of thoughts, unquote, and that this limit will be drawn in language, and that the other side of the limit will simply be nonsense. Lastly, he says that the value of his work consists both in the fact that it has solved all philosophical problems in their fundamental form, and that in doing so it shows how little is truly accomplished when they are solved. However, it is worth noting that the resolute reading ignores a substantial amount of Wittgenstein's attitude to his work, just as the traditional one does. Namely, it does not explain why Wittgenstein, later in his life, speaks in dismissive terms of his belief in logical atomism. For if he in truth only presented it here as an illustration of nonsense, he wouldn't have truly believed in it in the first place. Furthermore, when Frank Ramsey made substantial critiques of the more technical metaphysical aspects of the Tractatus, and mathematical ones, Wittgenstein saw them as legitimately dangerous to undermining the argument of the book, and felt somewhat disappointed and felt he had to essentially start from scratch, which wouldn't be the case if he believed these propositions were truly nonsense. So both readings have substantial advantages and weaknesses, and neither seems to be satisfactorily embraced by Wittgenstein himself, judging only on his words. But something even more confusing is found in a letter he wrote, where he said that the Tractatus was primarily an ethical work. This is deeply confusing on both the traditional and resolute readings. What does any of this critique of the possibility of either philosophical statements or metaphysics itself have to do with ethics? Michael Kremer offers an interesting perspective on this. While he doesn't completely fall in line with the resolute reading, he does see the traditional reading as having a problem at its core related to the idea of saying and showing. Wittgenstein repeatedly asserts that logic must, in his words, take care of itself, and his primary critiques of Russell and Frege are that they attempt to give a grounding for logic that is metaphysical, such as making laws of logical inference or logical objects. None of this is acceptable because logic has to be utterly simple and self-justifying, even though we want so badly to give it some kind of justification or grounding. However, his traditional readers have snuck the same problem in through the back door in their apprehending of this. They think that Wittgenstein is saying that there are ineffable, proposition-like insights in philosophy that show themselves without being said, and this is tempting because it serves as that ground that we yearn for so desperately without having to need further justification and grounding. But this all rests on a misunderstanding of the word show. To use Kremer's example, if you are going to take care of my cat while I am away, I can show you that there is enough food for the cat until I return. Then I can show you how to make the cat purr by stroking its chin. The first points to something that is a fact that could be true or false. It shows that something is. But the second does not. It shows how. It doesn't show some truth that is the case or not. And the Tractatus, if read traditionally as saying that logic shows its truths without saying them, is making confusion between these two uses of the word show. It is thinking that something showing how is something also showing that. But there is no that there. And this is what he means by nonsensical. They try to do the same thing that Russell and Frege do, thinking that the workings of logic show some ineffable that, which is able to be its own justification, is doing nothing but the same thing as Frege and Russell, trying to provide a justification for logic, instead of letting logic take care of itself. Logic needs no ground for its truth, even if that truth is something internal, ineffable, and self-revealing. Now, how does this relate to ethics? In 6.4, Wittgenstein explains that ethics tries to make statements about the whole world or life from a perspective outside of it. It tries to say something about the whole of the world when all we can talk about are particular facts of the world that are true or not. But interestingly, he doesn't say that ethics, and aesthetics for that matter, is nonsensical or meaningless. He says it is transcendental, And there is only one other thing in the Tractatus that he describes as transcendental, which is logic. In this way, Kremer sees that ethics has to have a similar position as logic. Ethics has to essentially take care of itself. Ethics, like logic, is groundless and can only be so. It is not that it provides its own justification. It's that they cannot be justified in any way because they stand before all justification. In this way, with the clarity that comes with this is not a proposition or ineffable truth, it's a clearness about how we should live. And this is to essentially free us from the need to justify ethics and define ethics, and just to let us be ethical, essentially. These are just a few interesting interpretations of the Tractatus. I personally became interested in it because I found a lot of parallels between Wittgenstein in the Tractatus and Nagarjuna in the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, a Buddhist philosopher from the 2nd to 3rd century who I've done a lot of research on. I find the two interesting in that they start from almost opposite metaphysical claims. Wittgenstein claims that all objects are independent and all states of affairs are independent and true or false on their own, while Nagarjuna explains that all things are dependently originated, which means that nothing has any kind of substantial reality that doesn't depend on anything else, and that in that way all phenomena is empty. However, ultimately, the two use their metaphysics to bring us to this quasi-mystical point where we're left by saying that the ultimate truth is that there is no ultimate truth, and it seems that even the metaphysics that they grounded their beliefs on have to be thrown out. The Tractatus is certainly still a controversial and difficult work, and I hope that this video has shed light on it and its fascinating insights. Wittgenstein himself said that the Tractatus was not a textbook, and that its purpose would be fulfilled if it gave pleasure to one who read it with understanding, and I hope I was able to help towards this purpose. Thank you for watching.